I buried my wife of 40 years this morning. 2 hours later, the dirt on her grave was not even dry when my own flesh and blood handed me an eviction notice. She left me a single brass key hidden in the lining of her coat, and I never expected it would unlock a web of hidden secrets. The truth I found was unthinkable. My name is Alfonso Reed. I am 69 years old, and before I tell you how I dismantled their entire lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been pushed to the edge by the very people you sacrificed everything for. The house was suffocatingly quiet when we walked in. I was still wearing my black suit. My bones ached from standing at Evelyn's graveside under the unforgiving Atlanta sun. I walked toward the kitchen just wanting a glass of water and a moment of silence. Instead, I got the sharp sound of a heavy folder hitting the oak dining table. I turned around. Courtney, my 34-year-old white daughter-in-law, stood there with her arms crossed. Her designer black dress looked more suited for a cocktail party than a funeral. Next to her stood my son, DeAndre. He was 38, a vice president at a logistics firm, but right now he looked like a frightened child staring intently at the hardwood floor. "Sign this," Alfonso, Courtney said. Her voice was ice cold, stripping away the fake sweet tone she used when company was around. I looked down at the documents. It was a transfer of deed and a total power of attorney. I looked back at her, waiting for a punchline to a very sick joke. "You want me to sign over the house Evelyn and I built just 2 hours after we put her in the ground?" I asked. My voice was low, a deep rumble born from decades of breathing in diesel fumes and dirt. "Evelyn left a massive amount of debt," Courtney stated flatly, stepping closer. "We had to do an audit of the estate. Your wife was hiding things. The only way to save this property from foreclosure is to put it in our names immediately. DeAndre handles complex logistics. My father, William, can manage the trusts. You are in no mental or financial state to deal with this." I looked at DeAndre. I waited for him to step up. I waited for the man I raised to defend his mother's honor. But he said nothing. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and refused to meet my eyes. "Evelyn did not owe a dime to anyone," I said, keeping my temper strictly contained. "She was a chief accountant. She balanced our checkbook to the exact penny every single Sunday for 40 years. Do not stand in my house and lie about the woman who just died." "Your house," Courtney scoffed, her pale face twisted into a smirk of pure disdain. "Not for long. Look around, Alfonso. You cannot afford the property taxes on this place with your meager pension. You are an old man living in the past. We are taking over the finances. And since we are taking on this massive burden, my parents are going to move into the master bedroom while they transition between properties. You need to gather your things." I stared at her, letting her words hang in the stagnant air. "You are kicking me out of my own home. I am offering you a choice," she snapped back, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail against the legal documents. "You can pack your bags and move down to the unfinished basement. We can put a space heater down there for you. Or you can pack your bags and go find a retirement home that accepts state subsidies. But the master suite belongs to my parents now. They are accustomed to a certain standard of living, and you simply do not need the space." DeAndre finally spoke, his voice weak and pathetic. "Dad, just sign it. Courtney knows what she is doing. Her family has wealth management experience. We are just trying to protect you." "Protect me," I repeated. The bitter taste of betrayal coated my tongue. "You want to put me in a cold concrete basement while her parents sleep in the bed I shared with your mother?" DeAndre shifted his weight. "It is just temporary, Dad, until things stabilize. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I looked at my son, and suddenly I did not recognize him. I saw the custom-tailored suit he was wearing. I saw the shiny imported watch on his wrist. He looked like the picture of upper-class success, but beneath the fabric, I saw the price tag. I paid for that image with my own blood. My mind pulled me back to the scorching summers in Georgia. I was a heavy machinery contractor. For 25 years, I operated excavators and bulldozers until my hands were thick with calluses and my back screamed in agony every morning. I worked double shifts, breathing in dust and exhaust fumes. Evelyn worked overtime at the accounting firm, bringing home ledgers to balance late into the night. We did it all to keep DeAndre out of the underfunded public schools. We paid exorbitant tuitions for private academies so he would not become a statistic. We wanted him to escape the generational poverty of the Southern working class. We gave him the world on a silver platter so he could sit at the big tables. I gave up my body so he would not have to use his. And this was my return on investment. He had adopted the snobbery of his wife's family entirely. He looked at me not as a father who sacrificed his youth, but as a lower-class blue-collar embarrassment he needed to hide away in a dark basement. A liability to his country club image. The profound disappointment did not make me yell. It did not make me cry. It turned my heart into a block of solid ice. I did not raise a man, I raised a parasite. Fine, I said calmly. My voice was dangerously quiet. I will go pack a few things. Courtney's smirk returned instantly. Good, she said, pulling a pen from her designer purse. Sign this first, and then you can take your time moving your junk downstairs. I am not signing anything right now, I replied, turning my back to them. I need to sort through Evelyn's clothes. I walked down the hall and entered the master bedroom, closing the door securely behind me. The scent of Evelyn's lavender perfume still lingered in the air. The bed was perfectly made. I walked over to her closet and opened the wooden doors. I reached for her old beige winter coat. It was the coat she wore every Sunday to church. As I grabbed the heavy wool fabric, my thick, calloused fingers felt something hard and unusual stitched inside the right pocket lining. Evelyn was meticulous. She never left objects in her pockets. I went to my nightstand, grabbed my pocket knife, and carefully slit the seam of the lining. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy brass key. It was a safety deposit box key with the number 402 stamped into the metal. Wrapped around the key was a small folded piece of lined notebook paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was Evelyn's neat, precise handwriting. The ink was fresh, probably written during her final days at the hospital when I stepped out of the room. The note was short, but the words hit me with the force of a freight train. Safe 402. Do not trust our son. I stood there in the quiet bedroom holding the key. My wife had known. While she was dying, she had uncovered something sinister enough to warn me from beyond the grave. I squeezed the brass key until it dug painfully into my palm. Courtney and DeAndre thought they were dealing with a broken, senile old man. They had no idea they had just declared war on a man who knew how to operate a wrecking ball. I did not pack a suitcase. A suitcase meant I was moving out. I grabbed a battered canvas duffel bag, tossed in a few changes of clothes, my shaving kit, and the old steel toe boots I used to wear on the job site. When I walked back into the living room, DeAndre and Courtney were still standing there, arms crossed, expecting a defeated old man to surrender his kingdom. I walked right past them toward the front door. "Where are you going?" Courtney demanded. Her voice was sharp, laced with that upper-crust authority she liked to wield like a weapon. "To get some air," I replied without looking back. "I will sign your papers when I return." I knew that lie would keep them sitting comfortably in my living room, drinking my liquor, waiting for a victory that would never arrive. I climbed into my 10-year-old Ford pickup. The engine roared to life, a rough and reliable sound. I drove out of my suburban neighborhood and headed straight for the grittier side of town, a place DeAndre and his wife would never dare to tread. I needed a sanctuary where their expensive lawyers and private investigators would not look. I found a rundown motel off the interstate. It was the kind of place with flickering neon signs and peeling paint. I paid the clerk in cash for a full week. Room number 12. It smelled of stale smoke and cheap pine cleaner, but it had a heavy deadbolt and no digital footprint. I locked the door, sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, and stared at the brass key in my palm. Tomorrow morning I was going to find out exactly what Evelyn died trying to protect. The First National Bank opened precisely at 9 o'clock the next morning. I was the first person through the glass double doors. I bypassed the tellers and walked straight to the vault manager. I showed her my identification and the brass key. She nodded, leading me down a quiet carpeted hallway into the reinforced vault, her heels clicking methodically against the floor. "Box 402, she said, unlocking her side of the mechanism before stepping back. I inserted Evelyn's key. The heavy metal door clicked open. Inside sat a single thick manila envelope. There was no jewelry. There were no stacks of emergency cash, just paper. But knowing my wife, that paper was worth a lot more than gold. I took the envelope to a private viewing booth, closed the door, and sat down under the harsh fluorescent light. I took a deep breath and dumped the contents onto the table. It was a masterclass in forensic accounting. Evelyn had spent her last weeks alive building a flawless, airtight paper trail. There were bank statements, property tax records, wire transfer receipts, and printed emails. She had highlighted specific dates and circled anomalous transactions in bright red ink. I put on my reading glasses and started to dig. Evelyn had always been the financial heartbeat of our family. She could spot a misaligned decimal point from a mile away. As I sifted through the documents, I saw the exact timeline of my son's financial collapse. DeAndre had been living far beyond his means for years. The country club memberships, the European vacations, the luxury cars, it was all a fragile facade funded by predatory credit lines and maxed out corporate accounts. But the sheer volume of the debt was staggering. It went beyond mere lifestyle inflation. The numbers simply did not make sense. You do not rack up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt just by buying designer suits and expensive dinners. Something else was draining the accounts. I organized the papers chronologically following Evelyn's red ink like a map through a minefield. That is when I found the loan agreement. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was from a major commercial lender. My eyes scanned the heavy legal jargon until they locked onto the principal amount. $500,000. A $500,000 cash loan. My stomach tightened. The collateral listed for this massive sum was not DeAndre's flashy imported car or his heavily mortgaged condo. The collateral was my house. The home Evelyn and I had paid off 15 years ago. The very roof over my head. I stared at the final page of the loan agreement. The signature line held two names. My name, Alfonso Reed, and my wife's name, Evelyn Reed. But the ink told a completely different story. I have known Evelyn's handwriting since we were high school sweethearts. Her cursive was elegant, precise, and slanted slightly to the right. The signature on this legal document was a sloppy, hurried imitation. The loops were wrong. The pressure was uneven. And my own signature next to it was a blatant forgery, a generic scrawl that looked absolutely nothing like my heavy, blocky print. DeAndre had stolen our identities. He had forged his own parents' signatures to take out a $500,000 mortgage on the house we built with our blood and sweat. He had gambled away our sanctuary. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My son, the boy I had worked double shifts to put through private school, had turned into a common criminal. Evelyn must have discovered the massive lien on our property during a routine credit check. She had spent her final agonizing days compiling this evidence, knowing the stress of it was probably accelerating her illness. She knew DeAndre was planning to steal the house out from under me the exact moment she took her last breath. That was why Courtney was so desperate to get my signature on that power of attorney document yesterday. They needed to legally cover their tracks before the bank came knocking for the collateral. They wanted me to willingly sign over the deed so they could legitimize the fraudulent loan. If I had signed that paper, I would have signed away my right to fight the foreclosure. I would have been legally responsible for a debt I never incurred. I would have been left homeless and they would have walked away clean. But the most horrifying revelation was buried at the very bottom of the envelope. I pulled out a wire transfer receipt attached to the loan payout. I expected to see the $500,000 deposited into DeAndre's personal bank account to cover his lavish lifestyle, but the money never touched his hands. The transfer routed the entire $500,000 through a corporate shell company and deposited it directly into a private wealth management fund. I looked closely at the beneficiary of that fund. The name printed in bold black letters was William Kensington, Courtney's father, the wealthy aristocratic white man who looked down his nose at me at my own wife's funeral. DeAndre was not the mastermind. He was the scapegoat. The Kensington family was secretly broke, leveraging their son-in-law to commit federal mortgage fraud to quietly bail out their own failing investments. Courtney married my son not for love, but for a compliant idiot she could manipulate. They were using DeAndre as a money mule, letting him forge the documents and take all the legal risks while her father pocketed the cash. When the federal authorities or the bank finally caught on, DeAndre would be the one facing 20 years in federal prison for identity theft and wire fraud. William Kensington would walk away with clean hands, claiming he knew absolutely nothing about his son-in-law's illegal activities. Courtney and her parents were ready to throw my son to the wolves, and DeAndre was too blinded by his desperate need for their upper-class validation to see the trap closing around his neck. I carefully placed the documents back into the envelope. They wanted to play a high-stakes financial game with a blue-collar worker. They were about to learn that heavy machinery operators know exactly how to demolish a structure down to its very foundation. I could have walked straight out of that bank and into the nearest federal investigation field office. I had the forged loan documents, I had the wire transfer receipts, I had enough hard evidence to put my son in a federal penitentiary before the sun went down. But calling the authorities now would be a massive tactical error. If I blew the whistle today, DeAndre would take the absolute brunt of the criminal charges. William Kensington would play the ignorant investor claiming his son-in-law acted entirely alone. The white-collar aristocrat would walk away without a single scratch while my son took the fall. I needed William to expose his own greed. I needed them all to dig their graves so deep that no expensive defense attorney could ever pull them out. To do that, I had to give them exactly what they wanted. They needed to believe they had already won. They needed to believe I was a broken, senile old black man who had lost his grip on reality. I drove back to my rundown motel room and began to construct my disguise. I dug into the bottom of my duffel bag and pulled out my oldest work clothes, a faded flannel shirt stained with years of motor oil and a pair of frayed denim trousers with worn-out knees. I did not shave. I rubbed a handful of parking lot dirt into my knuckles and under my fingernails. I stooped my shoulders, hiding my usual rigid posture to mimic the physical decline of a man defeated by grief and age. When I looked in the cracked bathroom mirror, I did not see Alfonso, the heavy machinery contractor. I saw a vulnerable, confused target. Perfect. I left the motel and took 2 public buses to the downtown financial district. DeAndre was the vice president of a high-end logistics firm housed in a towering skyscraper of glass and steel. It was a place designed to keep people who looked like me scrubbing the floors after hours. I shuffled through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the pristine marble lobby. The receptionist eyed me with immediate suspicion. I approached her massive polished desk, dragging my feet and letting my hands tremble slightly. I asked to see my son, DeAndre Reed. I made my voice crack, adopting the tone of a bewildered old man who did not know how to pay for his next meal. Before the receptionist could even dial his extension, the elevator chimed. DeAndre stepped out wearing a bespoke navy suit holding a leather briefcase. Right beside him, clinging to his arm, was Courtney. They must have been heading out for an expensive lunch. I stumbled toward them, reaching out with my dirty hands. DeAndre, I cried out, letting a pathetic tremor completely overtake my voice. Son, please, I need a few dollars for food. My pension check did not clear and I am so hungry. DeAndre froze. The color drained from his face as he looked around the bustling lobby. Dozens of corporate executives and clients had stopped in their tracks, turning their heads to watch the spectacle. A prominent vice president confronted by a ragged, seemingly homeless father begging for loose change. It was his absolute worst nightmare brought to life. He opened his mouth to speak, but Courtney stepped in front of him, instantly taking control. Her eyes were filled with absolute disgust. Alfonso, what are you doing here? She hissed, her voice echoing off the marble walls. We told you to stay at the house. You are having another one of your episodes. I kept my head bowed and reached out again. I just need a little money for a hot meal, Courtney. Please. I am so confused. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, ensuring everyone in the lobby could hear her play the role of the long-suffering daughter-in-law dealing with a crazy relative. This is entirely inappropriate, she announced loudly. You cannot come to my husband's workplace and harass us. You are completely out of your mind. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and threw it directly at my face. The green paper fluttered through the air and landed near my scuffed work boots. Buy yourself a sandwich and take a taxi back to the basement, she snapped. Then she snapped her fingers at the 2 large security guards stationed by the door. Escort this man off the premises immediately. He is disturbing the tenants. The security guards did not hesitate. They grabbed me by the arms with rough, unyielding force. I let my knees buckle slightly, dragging my weight to make myself look even more pathetic. As they hauled me across the slippery marble floor, I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, but my mind was working with lethal precision. I was taking a mental photograph of every single detail in that room. I memorized the mocking smirks on the faces of the junior executives who whispered to each other behind their coffee cups. I memorized the heavy grip of the security guards digging into my biceps. Most importantly, I memorized my son. DeAndre stood perfectly still, hiding behind his wife's shadow. He did not say a single word to defend me. He watched 2 strangers drag his father out of a building like a stray dog, and he simply looked away, adjusting his expensive cuffs. The humiliation burned. It was a hot, searing fire in my chest. A weaker man would have fought back. A weaker man would have thrown a punch, shouted the truth, or demanded respect. But I was a man who spent 25 years operating 50-ton excavators. I knew the value of patience. I knew that you have to endure the deafening noise and the crushing vibration before you can bring a massive structure down to the dirt. I swallowed my pride and let the humiliation wash over me because this was not about my ego. It was about casting a net. By playing the helpless fool, I was feeding Courtney's massive arrogance. Arrogant people get sloppy. They stop looking over their shoulders. They underestimate their prey. Let them laugh today. Their laughter was the very shovel they were using to dig their own graves. The guards shoved me through the revolving doors and released me onto the scorching concrete sidewalk. I stumbled forward, purposely falling to my knees on the pavement. A few pedestrians stepped around me, averting their eyes from the crazy old man making a scene. I waited until the security guards turned their backs and marched back into the air-conditioned lobby. As soon as the glass doors settled, my entire demeanor changed. The trembling in my hands stopped completely. I planted my boots firmly on the ground and stood up. I rolled my shoulders back, shaking off the guise of the defeated elder and restoring the rigid, proud posture of Alfonso Reed. A sleek, black luxury sedan glided smoothly up to the curb, completely ignoring the strict loading zone signs. The tinted rear window rolled down silently. I opened the heavy door and slid into the plush, air-conditioned leather interior, shutting out the noise of the bustling city. Sitting across from me was Richard Gallagher. He was one of the most ruthless and expensive civil and criminal litigators in the entire state of Georgia. He wore an immaculate charcoal pinstripe suit and possessed the sharp, calculating eyes of an apex predator. He had spent his entire career destroying corrupt corporations and dismantling fraudulent estates. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crisp $50 bill Courtney had thrown at my face, and tossed it onto the center console. Gallagher looked at the crumpled bill, then looked at me with a slow, predatory smile. He tapped his leather-bound folder containing all the evidence from Evelyn's safety deposit box. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew exactly what this operation required. "The bait is set," Mr. Reed Gallagher said, his voice smooth and deadly. "Now we wait for the rats to bite." The tinted windows of Gallagher's luxury sedan blocked out the glaring Atlanta sun, wrapping us in a cool, quiet bubble of absolute authority. I sank into the plush leather seat and watched the lawyer open the thick manila envelope I had brought from safety deposit box 402. Gallagher did not gasp or express moral outrage. Men like him did not deal in emotions. They dealt in leverage and destruction. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and spread Evelyn's meticulous paper trail across the pull-out mahogany table between us. I pointed to the forged signature on the $500,000 loan agreement. "My son thinks he is a financial genius," I said, my voice steady and hard. "He thinks he outsmarted a retired machine operator. He thinks he can steal my home and hand it to a man who looks down on our blood." Gallagher scrutinized the uneven loops of the fake signature under a small portable magnifying glass. "This is incredibly sloppy," he murmured, shaking his head. "It is entirely amateurish, but the bank approved it anyway because your property has 0 prior liens and massive equity. The loan officer likely saw a massive quick commission and simply looked the other way. He sifted through the wire transfer receipts, tracking the money straight into William Kensington's private wealth fund. Your daughter-in-law and her father are using your son as a human shield," Gallagher continued. "When this inevitably collapses, DeAndre goes straight to federal prison for mortgage fraud and identity theft. William Kensington keeps the cash offshore and claims he thought it was a legitimate business loan from his ambitious son-in-law. They played him beautifully." I looked out the tinted window at the towering corporate skyscraper I had just been thrown out of. "They played him," I agreed, "but they did not account for my wife." Gallagher pulled a secondary black folder from his own leather briefcase. "When you called me yesterday and told me the exact address of your property, I pulled the master deed from the county records," he said. "I wanted to see exactly what kind of asset we were defending from these vultures. I found something extraordinary. Your late wife was not just a brilliant accountant, Mr. Reed. She was a tactical visionary." I leaned forward, resting my thick elbows on my knees. "What did Evelyn do?" I asked. Gallagher slid a certified copy of the property deed across the table. 5 years ago, your wife quietly filed a highly obscure addendum to the title. She established a specific restrictive covenant on the property. In corporate finance, we call this a poison pill. It is an aggressive defensive strategy used to prevent hostile takeovers. Evelyn wrote a binding legal clause stating that absolutely no liens, mortgages, or transfers of ownership can be placed on this property without the physical in-person presence of both you and her at a highly specific designated law firm downtown. It requires strict biometric verification and dual notarization. My heart swelled with a fierce, painful pride. Evelyn had known even back then that DeAndre's reckless ambition was writing checks his reality could not cash. She saw the vultures circling long before they ever landed on our front lawn. She knew our son was trying to run with a crowd that would eventually bleed him dry. "What does that mean for this $500,000 loan?" I asked, tapping the forged legal document with my heavy finger. "It means the loan your son took out is structurally void." Gallagher smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile showing his teeth. "The bank failed to do their basic due diligence. The forged signatures are a crime, but the poison pill makes the entire financial contract completely unenforceable. The moment we bring this to light, the commercial bank will realize they just handed $500,000 to a ghost with no actual collateral to back it up. They will immediately panic and demand the money back in full. And if the money is gone," I said, finishing his thought, "it becomes a major federal crime," Gallagher confirmed. "But we are not going to tell the bank yet. We are going to let William Kensington think he got away with his grand theft. We are going to let him get comfortable. Then we are going to cut off his air supply entirely." Gallagher opened his sleek laptop and connected it to a secure mobile network. "William Kensington is a man who relies entirely on the illusion of liquid wealth," Gallagher explained as his fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard. "He needs constant cash flow to maintain his country club status and pay off his own hidden debts. That is exactly why he needed your $500,000 so desperately. He funneled it directly into his primary family trust to stop his own ship from sinking. So we are going to put that specific trust in a federal chokehold." I watched the screen as Gallagher navigated a complex labyrinth of federal financial databases. "I am filing an anonymous suspicious activity report with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network," he stated calmly, his eyes locked on the monitor. "I am flagging the exact routing number of the wire transfer your son initiated. I am citing strong evidence of money laundering and wire fraud directly associated with the Kensington Family Trust. Because the amount exceeds the federal threshold and involves offshore routing algorithms, an automatic administrative freeze will be triggered within the hour. By lunchtime today, William Kensington will not be able to buy a cup of coffee using that trust fund. Every single asset connected to his primary accounts will be locked down tight by the federal government pending a full and thorough investigation." I leaned back into the comfortable leather seat. I wanted them to feel the exact same helplessness they tried to force on me when they told me to pack my bags for the basement. I wanted them to wake up and realize the solid ground beneath their feet had completely vanished. "Do it," I said without a single ounce of hesitation. Gallagher hit the enter key. The screen flashed a confirmation prompt. The trap was officially sprung. Gallagher drove me back to my rundown motel on the edge of town. I walked into room 12, locked the heavy deadbolt, and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. I did not have to wait long for the shock wave to hit. Less than 2 hours later, my burner phone buzzed on the nightstand. I had cloned DeAndre's voicemail using a basic tech tool Evelyn had kept in her home office files, allowing me to intercept his incoming messages. I pressed the device to my ear and listened to the audio file. It was Courtney. The polished, arrogant woman who had thrown a $50 bill at my face just a few hours ago was completely gone. Her voice was shrill, hysterical, and echoing with pure, unadulterated panic. "DeAndre, pick up the phone," she screamed into the receiver. "I am standing inside the boutique, and my cards are declining. All of them. Even the black corporate card is declining. I just called my father, and he is losing his mind. The bank locked the family trust. The bank locked everything, DeAndre. They are saying something about a federal hold and an ongoing investigation. Where is the money from the house? You said the transfer was totally clean. You said your idiot father suspected nothing and the funds were cleared. You need to fix this right now, or my father is going to throw you straight under the bus. Call me back right now." The voicemail clicked off, leaving a heavy, satisfying silence in the motel room. I sat in the dim light and let out a long, slow breath. They were drowning. The fragile illusion of their elite wealth was shattered into a million pieces. The panic was setting in, and soon they would turn on each other like starving wolves backed into a corner. And the best part was they still thought I was just a broken, senile old man wandering the streets looking for a hot meal. They had no idea I was the one holding the match that just burned their entire empire to the ground. The burner phone on my motel nightstand vibrated again just 20 minutes after Courtney's hysterical voicemail ended. I looked at the glowing screen. It was DeAndre. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my thumb across the green icon. I held the phone to my ear but said nothing, letting the silence stretch. "Dad," DeAndre said. His voice was incredibly tight, strained by a panic he was desperately trying to hide. "Dad, I am so sorry about what happened at the office today. Courtney was just stressed. You know how she gets. We want to make it up to you. Please come back to the house tonight. We are cooking a big family dinner. We want to sit down and figure everything out together." I kept my voice low and unsteady, playing the role of a fractured man seeking shelter. "Are you sure, son?" I asked. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden, Dad. We just want you home. Please. William and his wife are here too. We are all family. Just take a cab. I will pay for it when you arrive." I hung up the phone and smiled in the dim light of the motel room. They were terrified. The federal freeze on the Kensington Trust had backed them into a desperate corner, and they needed me to sign away my rights immediately to liquidate the house and cover their tracks. I put my filthy work shirt back on and took a taxi to the suburban neighborhood I had lived in for over 3 decades. When I walked through the front door, the atmosphere was sickeningly sweet. The aroma of a catered dinner filled the air. Courtney greeted me with a forced, bright smile, completely erasing the memory of her throwing money at my face hours prior. William Kensington stood in my living room holding a glass of my expensive bourbon, playing the gracious host inside a house he did not own. They ushered me to the dining table with hollow apologies and empty words. We sat down at the large oak table. DeAndre sat next to Courtney, looking like a man marching toward an execution. He refused to make eye contact with me. William sat at the head of the table, a position that rightfully belonged to me. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and gave me a condescending smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Alfonso," William began, his voice dripping with that false, aristocratic warmth. "We have all had a very stressful week. Losing Evelyn was a tragedy, but we have to face reality. You are a man who has worked with his hands his whole life. A hard, grueling life. Men of your background rarely have the financial literacy required to navigate the complexities of a modern estate. And quite frankly, your behavior today at DeAndre's office shows that your mind is slipping. We are very concerned about your cognitive health." I looked down at my plate, letting my shoulders slump. "I do not understand," I mumbled. William reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick document, placing it gently on the table next to my plate. "We had a private consultation with a top-tier psychiatrist today," William continued smoothly. "Based on our detailed descriptions of your recent erratic behavior and your severe memory lapses, he has prepared this medical certificate. It legally declares that you are currently suffering from advanced cognitive decline. It grants DeAndre and Courtney full medical and financial conservatorship over your estate. It is for your own protection, Alfonso. You belong in a specialized care facility where you can be looked after. We will handle the sale of this house and manage the assets so you never have to worry again." They had bought a crooked doctor. They were trying to medically erase my autonomy to bypass the property deed restrictions. DeAndre finally looked up, his eyes pleading with me to just give in. "Dad, please sign it. It is the only way to fix this mess. It is the only way we can move forward." My son was completely oblivious. He thought signing this document would somehow unfreeze the trust fund and save his marriage. He did not realize this piece of paper was the final nail in his own coffin. If I signed it, William would have total legal authority to sell the property without my presence, fulfilling the poison pill requirement and legitimizing the fraudulent $500,000 mortgage DeAndre had taken out. I stared at the document. The crisp white paper sat right next to a large crystal glass filled to the brim with ice water. I knew Gallagher needed more time to tighten the federal snare around William's offshore accounts. I needed to delay them, and I needed to destroy that specific document. I slowly reached my hand out toward the paper. I commanded my fingers to tremble violently. I let my breathing become shallow and ragged, mimicking the panic of a confused elder. "My hands, they just do not work like they used to," I whispered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "I cannot seem to grip the pen." Courtney sighed loudly, her fake patience wearing thin. "Just grip it firmly, Alfonso. We do not have all night." I reached for the silver pen William offered, but I intentionally misjudged the distance. I slammed my heavy, calloused wrist directly into the tall glass of ice water. The heavy crystal tipped over and crashed onto the table. A massive wave of freezing water flooded directly over the psychiatric certificate. The thick black ink of the corrupt doctor's signature instantly bled and smeared across the page, rendering the legal document completely unreadable and entirely invalid. Courtney let out a furious, piercing shriek, jumping back as the water dripped onto her expensive dress. William slammed his fist on the table, his mask of aristocratic calm shattering for a fraction of a second. "Look what you did!" William barked, his face turning red with sudden rage. I shrank back into my chair, raising my hands defensively. "I am so sorry," I cried out, playing the pathetic victim perfectly. "I told you I am clumsy. My vision is blurry. I did not mean to ruin the paper. I am just so confused." DeAndre rushed to grab napkins, but William waved him off with a look of pure disgust. "Do not bother," William snapped, snatching the soaked, ruined document from the table. "It is completely destroyed. The notary will never accept a smeared medical certificate. Courtney, come with me to the kitchen. We need to print a fresh copy from the encrypted email and dry this mess up. Stay here and watch him." William ordered my son. William and Courtney stormed off toward the kitchen, leaving DeAndre and me alone in the dining room. DeAndre kept his head down, furiously wiping the spilled water with a cloth. He could not even look at his own father. I slowly stood up from my chair, leaning heavily on the table for support. "I need to get a towel," I mumbled, shuffling slowly toward the kitchen. DeAndre did not try to stop me. He just kept scrubbing the wood. I walked quietly down the short hallway, stopping just outside the kitchen door. The door was slightly ajar. I stood in the shadow, pressing my back against the wall, and held my breath. I could hear the printer humming as it produced a new copy of the fraudulent document. I could also hear Courtney pacing furiously across the tile floor. "This is a disaster, Dad," Courtney hissed, her voice low and frantic. "The federal hold is still on your trust account. The bank is asking questions about the original loan source. If we do not get the title to this house transferred to us by tomorrow morning, they are going to trace the forged signatures straight back to DeAndre." William let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. "Calm down, Courtney. You are panicking over nothing. The old fool is senile. We will put the new paper in front of him and force his hand to sign it." "But what about DeAndre?" she asked, her voice shaking. "The feds are already looking at the wire transfers." William lowered his voice, but I could hear the absolute venom in every single word. "Forget your husband, Courtney. DeAndre is collateral damage. He was always collateral damage. Once the old man signs this medical certificate, we have total, undisputed legal control of the estate. The second the ink is dry, we immediately contact the FBI ourselves. We hand them the forged mortgage documents. We tell the federal agents that DeAndre acted entirely alone. We testify that he forged our names, forged his parents' names, and funneled the money to cover his own gambling debts." I stood in the darkness, my blood running colder than the ice water I had just spilled. William continued outlining his master plan with ruthless precision. "We take the house and liquidate it to cover the frozen funds. We throw DeAndre to the wolves. He goes to federal prison for 20 years, and we walk away with completely clean hands. He is a pathetic, useful idiot, and he has served his purpose. Now dry your dress and get back out there. We need that signature tonight." I stepped back silently, retreating down the hallway before they could exit the kitchen. I returned to my seat at the dining table, masking my rigid posture and returning to the slump of a defeated old man. I looked across the table at DeAndre. He was still scrubbing the table, desperate to keep his wife and father-in-law happy. He had betrayed me, sold our family home, and treated me like trash to secure his place in their elite world. And the very people he worshipped were currently in the next room, preparing to feed him to the federal government without a second thought. The anger inside me shifted. It was no longer a burning rage. It was a cold, absolute certainty. My son was about to be destroyed by the monsters he invited into my home. If I walked away now, he would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell. I had to let him feel the jaws of the trap snap shut. I had to let him realize he was bleeding. It was the only way to wake him up. When William and Courtney returned to the dining room with a fresh, crisp document, I did not spill the water again. I looked at the paper, and I prepared to execute the most dangerous maneuver of my entire life as William and Courtney marched back into the dining room holding a freshly printed copy of their fraudulent psychiatric certificate. The burning fury inside my chest solidified into absolute zero ice. I looked across the oak table at DeAndre. He was my own flesh and blood. He was the boy I had sacrificed my body for operating heavy machinery until my joints screamed in agony. And there he was, frantically wiping up spilled ice water like a terrified servant, just to appease the very people who were actively plotting his federal prison sentence. A father's natural instinct is to protect his child at all costs. But protecting DeAndre right now would only validate his treacherous behavior. He needed to be broken down completely. He needed to feel the exact same sharp knife of betrayal that he had so willingly plunged into my back. I decided right then and there to let him walk blindly into the slaughterhouse. I would not warn him about the conversation I just overheard in the kitchen. I would let him taste the bitter ash of the elite world he chose over his own family. Only when he hit the absolute rock bottom would he finally wake up and realize what he had thrown away. I watched his trembling hands scrub the wood. This was a 38-year-old man who had discarded his heritage, disrespected his late mother, and tried to toss his grieving father into a damp concrete basement. If I shielded him from William Kensington's fangs, he would never learn. He would spend the rest of his life thinking he was just one bad real estate deal away from being part of their country club. I locked my pain away in a dark corner of my mind. I buried the grieving father and fully embraced the tactician. I would save him from federal prison at the absolute last second, but I would not save him from the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. William slammed the fresh medical certificate onto the table next to a silver pen. "Sign it, Alfonso," he demanded. "No more games." I looked at the paper, then reached into the pocket of my worn flannel shirt. I pulled out a folded legal document. My hands shook perfectly as I unfolded it on the table. "I do not understand your doctor papers," I stammered, keeping my voice thoroughly pathetic and weak. "But I went to my old union representative today. He gave me this. It is a standard financial power of attorney. It gives DeAndre complete control of my retirement accounts and the house deed. I will sign this one. I just want to rest." William snatched the document from my hands. His greedy eyes scanned the pages quickly. It looked like a standard, ironclad transfer of financial authority. What William did not know was that Richard Gallagher had drafted this specific document just a few hours ago in the back of his luxury sedan. It was loaded with highly technical, intentionally contradictory clauses. It invoked outdated state statutes and purposely lacked the specific indemnification phrasing required by modern federal banking laws. To a layman or an arrogant aristocrat rushing to save his frozen offshore accounts, it looked like a golden ticket. To a trained bank compliance officer, it was a legally toxic piece of garbage. William nodded at Courtney, a triumphant smirk spreading across his pale face. "This will do perfectly," he declared. "Sign it right here at the bottom." I took the silver pen. I let my hand hover over the signature line, acting as though I was signing away my entire life and freedom. I pressed the ink into the paper and wrote my name. DeAndre let out a massive sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping as if a massive weight had been lifted off his back. Courtney actually clapped her hands together, a sharp, joyous sound that echoed offensively through my dining room. "We did it," William said, rolling up the document like a conquered flag. "We are finally in control. Now, Alfonso, go gather your things. You are moving to the basement tonight." I nodded subserviently, hiding the dark, victorious smile fighting to break across my face. They celebrated their brilliant victory, having no idea they just swallowed a mouthful of broken glass. The following morning, I sat in my dingy motel room with my burner phone resting on the cracked laminate nightstand. Gallagher had tapped into the banking network using his law firm's rapid notification system. Every time my social security number was run for a major transaction, we would know instantly. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, the alert chimed loudly. DeAndre was making his move. I could easily picture the entire scene playing out. My son, dressed in another one of his pristine, custom-tailored suits, walking arrogantly into the First National Bank branch downtown. He would completely bypass the standard teller lines demanding to see the branch manager directly. He would confidently slide the flawed power of attorney across the polished mahogany desk, expecting immediate, unquestioning compliance. He was going after the primary target first. My heavy machinery union retirement fund. It held over $200,000 in liquid cash. It was money I had broken my back for over 3 decades of grueling labor. He needed to drain that specific account to appease William Kensington and desperately plug the bleeding holes in their fraudulent lifestyle. He thought he was walking into that bank as a powerful financial executor. He thought the money was already in his pocket. He had absolutely no idea he was walking straight into a high-voltage electric fence. My phone vibrated again. It was a direct call from Gallagher. He answered with a sharp, humorless chuckle. "Your son is currently sitting at the branch manager's desk," Mr. Reed Gallagher said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. The bank just ran the power of attorney through their legal compliance software. The system immediately flagged the document as fundamentally defective and completely void. But that is not even the best part. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, feeling the anticipation rise in my chest. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said. Gallagher continued, his tone perfectly clinical. "The manager just informed DeAndre that even if the document were legally sound, the transaction is entirely blocked. When the bank queried your financial profile, it triggered the federal alert I planted yesterday. The manager just looked your son dead in the eye and told him that your accounts are under an active high-priority investigation by the Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network." "And what reason did they give him?" I asked, a cold thrill rushing through my veins. The manager informed him that the accounts are frozen due to suspected money laundering and wire fraud directly associated with Mr. William Kensington, Gallagher said. I imagined the exact look on DeAndre's face right at that very second, the sheer unadulterated terror washing over him. He had walked into that bank thinking he was a king. Instead, he was just informed by a federal banking official that his wealthy father-in-law was the target of a massive federal probe. By attempting to transfer funds using a forged mortgage network, DeAndre had just linked himself directly to a federal crime scene. A cold sweat would be soaking through his expensive designer shirt. The walls of his fake elite life were rapidly closing in, and the very people he had sold his soul to were the ones holding the executioner's axe. The trap was fully triggered. DeAndre practically ripped the front door off its hinges when he stormed back into my house. He found Courtney pacing the living room floor, gripping a glass of white wine so tightly her knuckles were translucent. He dropped his leather briefcase on the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The bank rejected the power of attorney. He shouted, his voice cracking with an unhinged panic. "They did not just reject it, Courtney. The branch manager looked me in the eye and told me the account is frozen by the federal government. The Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network are actively investigating your father for money laundering and wire fraud." Courtney dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the wooden baseboard, sending sharp fragments of glass and pale liquid flying across the polished floor. She stared at him, her chest heaving. But she did not confess. She did not apologize for dragging him into a federal crime ring or using him as a disposable mule. Instead, she deployed the ultimate weapon of a manipulative aristocrat. She burst into tears. Perfect heavy crocodile tears streamed down her carefully powdered cheeks. She collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "This is all a horrific misunderstanding," she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "My father is a good man, DeAndre. He is a legitimate wealth manager. Your senile father must have triggered a red flag with his erratic banking history, and now the government is overreacting and targeting my family. You know how the federal agencies operate. They freeze everything first and ask questions later." She looked up at him, her mascara running, playing the role of the helpless damsel in distress to absolute perfection. "We are completely financially paralyzed. My father's reputation is on the line, and if he goes down, we lose everything. We lose our country club memberships, our cars, our entire life." DeAndre stood paralyzed, caught between the terrifying reality of federal prison and the intoxicating illusion of his upper-class lifestyle. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked desperately, pacing the room and pulling at his expensive silk tie. "The commercial bank is going to ask for the collateral on that $500,000 loan any day now. If the trust is frozen, we cannot make the first payment. They will foreclose on this house and pull the original signatures. We will both go to jail, Courtney." Courtney stood up, wiping her fake tears away, and walked over to her designer handbag. She pulled out a thick black folder and laid it on the coffee table. "My father has private liquidity partners," she said, her voice suddenly steady and coldly pragmatic. "Shadow investors who operate entirely outside the federal banking system. They can wire the $500,000 directly to the commercial bank to pay off the forged loan immediately. It completely erases the paper trail. The commercial bank gets their money and they close the file. The federal investigators will hit an absolute dead end." DeAndre stared at the black folder, his breathing shallow. "Private liquidity partners," he echoed. "You mean loan sharks? You want to borrow $500,000 from the criminal underworld." Courtney slammed her hand on the table. "I am trying to save your life, DeAndre. My father cannot sign for this capital because his name is flagged by the feds. You have to be the primary guarantor. It is a bridge loan, just a temporary measure to bail out my father's honor and protect our family name. I saw the paperwork. It is a 30% interest rate compounded monthly with an immediate default clause. But once the federal freeze is lifted, my father will pay off the private investors and you will be completely clear." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his neck, pressing her body against his. This is how you prove you belong in this family, DeAndre. You step up when the pressure is on. Or are you just going to let us lose everything and go back to being the son of a blue-collar dirt pusher? The insult to my legacy was the exact push he needed. His profound insecurity blinded him to the obvious trap. He was terrified of losing her and the status she represented. DeAndre reached into his jacket, pulled out his expensive fountain pen, and signed his name at the bottom of the predatory contract. He just legally bound himself to a violent underground syndicate with an extortionate interest rate he could never possibly repay. I watched the entire pathetic scene unfold in brilliant high definition from the dark confines of my motel room. My tablet screen cast a cold blue glow across my face. I was tapped directly into the hidden security cameras meticulously installed inside the smoke detectors and air vents of my own living room. Evelyn had placed them there 4 years ago. My brilliant wife had noticed small amounts of cash and valuable family heirlooms going missing shortly after DeAndre and Courtney got married. She wanted undeniable proof before she confronted her only son about stealing from his own mother. She never got the chance to use the footage before she got sick, but her extreme caution was now my greatest tactical advantage. I watched DeAndre cap his pen and hand the signed death warrant over to his smiling wife. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I felt absolute disgust. I had spent decades breaking my back in the scorching Georgia heat working heavy machinery so my son could have a better life. And there he was, standing in the house I paid for, signing his soul over to violent criminals just to impress a white woman who viewed him as a disposable pawn. He traded his dignity, his family, and his freedom for the illusion of wealth. I closed the video application on my tablet. The bait had been completely swallowed. DeAndre had bypassed the federal banking system entirely and stepped directly into the lawless shadows. It was time to close the jaws of the trap. I picked up my burner phone and dialed Richard Gallagher's private secure line. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice sharp and alert. "Gallagher," I said, staring at the peeling wallpaper of my motel room. "My son just signed a $500,000 private liquidity bridge loan. Courtney Kensington orchestrated it. They are using shadow investors to pay off the commercial bank and cover up the forged mortgage before the feds dig any deeper." Gallagher let out a low, appreciative whistle. "They are jumping from the frying pan directly into the fire," he said. "Shadow investors operate on brutal terms. Do we know which specific syndicate they used?" "Courtney's father set it up," I replied. "William Kensington is a desperate man. He would use the quickest, dirtiest money available in Atlanta." "I know exactly who Kensington associates with in the private lending sector," Gallagher said. "It is a firm operating out of a shell corporation in Buckhead. They charge catastrophic interest rates, and they break legs when people default." "What is your directive, Mr. Reed?" I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out the financial ledger Evelyn had hidden in the safety deposit box. My union retirement accounts were frozen, but Evelyn had quietly diverted over $1 million in liquid capital into a private offshore holding company over the last 10 years, specifically to hide it from DeAndre. "Contact the shadow lender immediately," I instructed, my voice devoid of any mercy. "Use Evelyn's offshore funds. Offer them a 20% premium to buy out my son's debt paper right now. They will gladly take clean laundered cash and walk away without a second thought." "Understood," Gallagher said, a dark amusement coloring his tone. "The underworld respects cash above all else. I will draft the assignment of debt paperwork. I will have the entire loan contract legally transferred and assigned directly to your holding company by midnight." I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the nightstand. Courtney thought she was clever, tying my son to the criminal underworld to save her own skin. She had no idea that I was about to buy the contract. I was no longer just the betrayed father watching from the sidelines. I was now DeAndre's absolute and ultimate creditor. I held his financial and physical life in the palm of my calloused hands. The clock was officially ticking on his survival, and I was going to collect every single penny. The buyout of the debt contract went through seamlessly. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I was the legal owner of a $500,000 predatory loan with a catastrophic default clause. I did not waste a single minute. I instructed Gallagher to deploy his private security contractors. They were highly trained former military men who knew exactly how to look and act like underground enforcers. They did not send a polite email or a formal letter. They paid DeAndre a personal visit. At exactly noon, they walked right past the security desk at his corporate logistics firm. Two massive men in dark suits stepped into his glass-walled office and locked the door behind them. I watched the entire interaction later through the security footage Gallagher obtained. They threw the newly assigned contract onto DeAndre's pristine glass desk. They did not raise their voices. They spoke with the quiet, terrifying calm of men who break bones for a living. They informed my son that his original investors had sold his paper. The new creditors were calling the loan due immediately. Because of the extreme risk profile and the default clauses hidden in the fine print, the total amount owed with interest and penalties was now $600,000. They gave him exactly 7 days to produce the cash in full. If he failed to deliver, they promised they would start taking their payment in flesh. They left the office as quietly as they had entered, leaving DeAndre suffocating in his own terror. The countdown clock was officially ticking. Panic is a highly predictable emotion. When a weak man realizes he is standing on the tracks and the train is coming, he does not brace for impact. He runs crying to anyone who will shield him. DeAndre drove his expensive imported car straight to the sprawling Kensington estate in the affluent northern suburbs. I listened to the encounter through the phone tap Gallagher had legally established on DeAndre's mobile device under the guise of the debt collection. DeAndre pounded on the heavy mahogany front door of his father-in-law's mansion. William opened it, but he did not invite my son inside. He stood on the threshold looking at DeAndre like a piece of trash that had blown onto his perfectly manicured lawn. DeAndre begged him for the money. He pleaded with William to liquidate an asset or borrow against the estate to pay off the shadow investors. He reminded William that he only signed the brutal contract to save the Kensington family name. William let out a cold, dismissive laugh. "You signed a contract with criminals under your own name," William said, his voice devoid of any human empathy. "My trust accounts are frozen by the federal government because of your sloppy paperwork. I have no liquid capital to spare for a fool who cannot manage his own debts. Take responsibility like a man, DeAndre. You are not dragging my family down into your gutter." William stepped back and slammed the heavy door directly in his face. The sound echoed with brutal finality. DeAndre was completely abandoned by the man he had idolized. But the ultimate betrayal was waiting for him back at my house. When DeAndre rushed home to formulate a new plan with his wife, he found the master bedroom empty. Courtney's designer luggage was completely gone. Her expensive clothes, her jewelry, and her imported cosmetics had vanished. She had left a single typed note on the kitchen island. The audio tap picked up DeAndre's ragged breathing as he read it aloud to the empty room. She wrote that the stress of his criminal associations was too much for her mental health. She was moving back in with her parents indefinitely until he sorted out his violent legal troubles. She told him not to contact her. The woman who had orchestrated the entire fraudulent scheme, who had practically guided his hand to sign the predatory loan, had packed her bags and left him to face the executioners alone. His elite white wife and her aristocratic family had bled him dry and threw his empty carcass to the wolves. DeAndre had no money. He had no powerful allies. He had no wife. He was completely out of options. Desperation stripped away his designer suits and his corporate arrogance, leaving only a terrified, broken boy. It took him 2 days to track me down. He finally pulled up to my dingy motel on the edge of town. I was sitting in the single plastic chair by the window when he pounded on the cheap, hollow door of room number 12. I opened it and looked at my son. He looked like a corpse. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin was pale, and his clothes were wrinkled. The pristine vice president was entirely gone. He collapsed onto the dirty motel carpet right at my worn work boots. He dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around my legs, sobbing uncontrollably. "Dad, you have to help me," he begged, his voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. "I made a terrible mistake. These men are going to kill me. They want $600,000 by Friday, or they are going to break my legs and throw me in the river. I have nothing left. Courtney left me. William abandoned me. Please, Dad, you are the only one who can save my life." I looked down at him, feeling the cold steel of my resolve lock firmly into place. "What exactly do you want me to do, DeAndre?" I asked, maintaining the facade of a clueless old man. "You have the ancestral land down in the country," he cried out, his face wet with tears. "The 50 acres Grandpa left you. It is fully paid off. It is unencumbered. We can sell it quickly to a commercial developer. Please, Dad, I will pay you back every single cent. I swear on my life. Sell the land and save me." I looked down at my weeping son. He was willing to strip away the last remaining piece of his grandfather's legacy just to save his own skin. He had learned absolutely nothing about loyalty or respect. He only cared about survival. I reached down and grabbed him by the shoulders, pulling him up from the filthy carpet. "I will do it," I said, my voice rough and weary. "I will sell the land. I spoke to a commercial developer last month before your mother passed. They offered me $3 million to turn that acreage into a massive logistics hub. The money can clear your debts and fix everything." DeAndre's eyes widened with sheer disbelief and desperate greed. $3 million. It was a lifeline beyond his wildest comprehension. "Oh my God, Dad, thank you," he gasped, grabbing my hands. "Thank you. We can fix everything." But I raised my hand, silencing his pathetic celebration. "I have one strict condition, DeAndre. My union lawyer told me that transferring an asset of that size requires absolute legal clarity to avoid heavy tax penalties. I need family witnesses present at the closing to verify I am of sound mind and acting voluntarily. You need to bring Courtney and William to the notary office on Friday morning. I will not sign a single document unless your wife and your father-in-law are sitting in that room looking me in the eye." DeAndre swallowed hard, clearly terrified of facing them again. But the promise of $3 million was the ultimate bait. "I will get them there, Dad," he promised, his voice shaking with renewed adrenaline. "I swear to you they will be there." He stumbled out of the motel room thinking he had just manipulated his ignorant father into saving his life. He had no idea I had just locked the door to the slaughterhouse. DeAndre scrambled out of my motel room, practically sprinting to his car with his phone already glued to his ear. I stood by the window watching his taillights speed away into the night. I had just handed a drowning man an imaginary life raft, and he gripped it with a desperation so intense it completely blinded him to reality. The 50 acres of ancestral land down in South Georgia had belonged to my grandfather. It was beautiful, rich red earth, but it was practically worthless for commercial development. It sat miles away from the nearest highway. There were no zoning changes, no massive logistics hubs, and certainly no $3 million buyouts waiting on the table. But DeAndre did not know that. He had never once visited the property. He had always viewed my family's rural heritage with deep embarrassment, preferring the polished concrete of the city over the dirt that built his foundation. That arrogant ignorance was the exact blind spot I needed to exploit. $3 million is a magical number. It is a sum of money large enough to completely erase massive debts, silence any lingering doubts, and reignite the dormant greed of a family that had just declared bankruptcy. It was the perfect bait. I knew DeAndre would take my lie and run straight back to the very people who had just thrown him to the wolves. He believed that delivering a $3 million payout would instantly restore his status as the golden son-in-law. He thought the money would buy back his wife's affection and secure William Kensington's respect. He was running back into the burning building, entirely convinced he was holding a fire extinguisher. Richard Gallagher's surveillance network captured the exact moment the bait was swallowed. Sitting in my motel room, I listened to the intercepted audio feed from DeAndre's cell phone. He dialed Courtney's number. It rang 4 times before she finally answered. Her tone was sharp and completely devoid of any warmth. "What do you want, DeAndre?" she snapped. "I told you not to call me here." DeAndre's voice was breathless, manic with adrenaline. "Courtney, listen to me," he pleaded. "You have to listen. My father is selling the family land down south. A commercial developer is buying it for a logistics center. They are paying him $3 million in cash. I convinced him to use the funds to clear my debt paper and transfer the rest into our accounts to avoid capital gains taxes." $3 million, Courtney. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and palpable. I could practically hear the gears turning in her calculating mind. The cold, dismissive aristocrat vanished in a single heartbeat. "Oh my God, DeAndre!" Courtney gasped, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickening manufactured sweetness. "Are you serious?" $3 million. "Yes," DeAndre confirmed eagerly. "But he requires you and your father to be at the notary office downtown this Friday morning to witness the transfer. If you do not show up, he will not sign the deed." I heard the rustling of a phone being handed over. Then William Kensington's deep, authoritative voice came through the speaker. "DeAndre, my boy," William said effortlessly, reviving the paternal affection he had completely discarded just 2 days prior. "I always knew you were a resourceful man. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking this family needs. Of course, Courtney and I will be there to support you. We are family after all. We stick together through thick and thin." The sheer hypocrisy of his words made my stomach churn. DeAndre thanked him profusely, his voice thick with pathetic gratitude, completely failing to realize he had just invited two starving vultures to a feast. What DeAndre did not hear was the conversation that took place immediately after he hung up the phone. Gallagher had managed to compromise the Bluetooth microphone in William Kensington's luxury SUV, capturing the father and daughter's private discussion as they drove through the affluent northern suburbs. I put my headphones on and listened to the true depth of their treachery. "This changes everything," Courtney said, her voice practically buzzing with greed. $3 million. We can pay off the shadow investors, clear the $500,000 loan at the commercial bank, and still have $2.5 million left to inject into the family trust. William let out a low, predatory chuckle. "Exactly," he agreed. "But we need to secure the capital routing before the old man realizes what is happening. We will have the notary draft an immediate transfer of funds into the Kensington primary holding account for tax protection. As soon as the wire clears, the money is ours." "And what about DeAndre?" Courtney asked, her tone entirely devoid of any spousal loyalty. William's response was ice cold. "We stick to the original plan. We use a fraction of the new money to erase the loan shark debt so he does not get his legs broken before the feds arrive. But the forged mortgage documents are still sitting in a commercial bank. The moment the $3 million clears into our accounts, I am calling the FBI director myself. I will hand over the forged papers and tell them DeAndre acted alone to steal from his own father. He goes to federal prison, and we walk away with his entire family inheritance. They were planning to steal my grandfather's legacy, cure their financial ruin, and still send my son to a concrete cell. It was a masterpiece of aristocratic malice. It was Thursday night, the eve of the notary appointment. The air in my dingy motel room felt thick and charged with electricity. I sat at the small, wobbly desk and opened the heavy manila envelope from safety deposit box 402 for the very last time. Evelyn's meticulous paper trail was spread out before me. The forged loan documents, the shell company wire transfers, the routing numbers tracing directly to William Kensington's offshore accounts. She had spent her final days breathing life into this weapon, and it was finally time to pull the trigger. I opened my encrypted laptop provided by Gallagher specifically for this moment. I scanned every single document, converting Evelyn's physical evidence into pristine, undeniable digital files. I drafted an email to the tip line of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division, copying the lead investigator of the Internal Revenue Service. I did not write a long, emotional letter. I kept it brief, clinical, and completely devastating. I attached the forged mortgage contract, highlighted the routing numbers, and provided a detailed breakdown of how William Kensington utilized his son-in-law to commit $500,000 in federal mortgage fraud. I included the audio files of William explicitly detailing his plan to frame DeAndre and launder the stolen funds. I stared at the glowing screen. For 40 years, I had built my life with my bare hands. Tomorrow, I was going to tear down an empire with a single keystroke. I looked up at the ceiling, thinking of Evelyn. "This is for you, my love," I whispered into the quiet room. I moved my finger across the trackpad and pressed send. The progress bar flashed green. The files vanished into the federal database. The bomb was officially armed, and tomorrow morning at the notary office, William Kensington was going to step directly onto the landmine. The morning sun hit the Atlanta skyline with a blinding glare, but William Kensington was already basking in his own manufactured glory. Thanks to the highly sensitive audio surveillance Richard Gallagher had embedded in DeAndre's phone, I listened to their entire ride to the downtown notary office. They were traveling in William's armored luxury SUV, sipping sparkling water and practically salivating over the imaginary $3 million. Courtney sounded giddy. She was wearing her finest designer dress, completely re-energizing her aristocratic persona now that she believed their financial crisis was over. She let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh that echoed through the vehicle. "I cannot believe the old man actually bought the story," she sneered. "A commercial logistics center in the middle of nowhere, Georgia. He is so desperate for your approval, DeAndre, he is practically handing us the keys to the kingdom without asking a single valid question." William joined in with a low, rumbling chuckle. "You have to give the blue-collar worker some credit, Courtney. He spent 40 years playing in the dirt just so we could properly invest his capital today. It is the natural order of things. The working class builds the foundation, and the elite manage the estate." DeAndre sat in the back seat and offered a weak, pathetic laugh of agreement. My son, dressed in a sharp silver suit, was nervously adjusting his tie, entirely focused on escaping the violent shadow investors. He had no idea his wife and father-in-law were treating him like a sacrificial lamb. They mocked my intelligence, my worn-out work boots, and my supposed senility. They laughed about how incredibly easy it was to legally separate a grieving old man from his ancestral legacy. I listened to their vile arrogance through the earpiece and felt absolutely nothing. You do not get angry at pigs for rolling in the mud. You just lock the gate to the slaughterhouse. On the exact opposite side of the city, I stood inside the master suite of a secure luxury penthouse Gallagher had rented for the morning. The rundown motel room and the stained flannel shirts had officially served their purpose. The theatrical act was over. I took a long, hot shower, scrubbing the staged grease and parking lot dirt from my knuckles and fingernails. I shaved the patchy, unkempt stubble from my jaw, leaving a perfectly trimmed, sharp gray beard. I walked over to the heavy mahogany wardrobe where a premium garment bag hung waiting for me. I unzipped the thick canvas and pulled out an absolute masterpiece. It was a bespoke charcoal gray three-piece suit cut from heavy Italian wool, tailored specifically to my broad, heavy machinery frame. I slipped into the crisp white cotton shirt and fastened the buttons. I slid the silk vest over my chest and pulled on the tailored trousers. They fit with absolute flawless perfection. I tied a deep burgundy silk tie around my collar and slid my feet into a pair of handcrafted black leather Oxfords, polished to a mirror shine. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror and looked at my reflection. The broken, hunched-over victim from the bank lobby was dead and buried. The confused, stumbling elder from the dining room table was completely gone. Looking back at me was Alfonso Reed, the patriarch, the master contractor, a man who built a fortune with calloused hands and an iron will. I adjusted the silver cuffs on my wrists and felt the sheer weight of my own true authority return to my bones. For weeks I had allowed them to treat me like a lower-class nuisance. I let Courtney throw $50 in my face. I let William speak to me like a slow-witted servant. I let my own son believe I was a fragile stepping stone to his upper-class fantasies. I had lowered my head and hidden my strength because an ambush requires absolute stealth. But today there was no more hiding. Today I was walking into that room as the executioner. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out the small brass key Evelyn had hidden in the lining of her winter coat. I held the cold, heavy metal in my palm and closed my eyes, letting the absolute quiet of the penthouse wash over me. I could almost smell the faint, comforting scent of her lavender perfume lingering in the air. "We did it, Evie," I whispered into the empty room. "We caught them all." I thought back to the decades we spent building our life together from the ground up. The late nights she spent sitting at the kitchen table with her calculator, making sure every single dime we earned was fiercely protected. I thought of the heavy sacrifices we made, the vacations we skipped, and the luxury we denied ourselves just to secure a brilliant future for a son who ultimately despised us. You saw the truth long before I did, Evelyn. You knew the venom hiding behind William Kensington's firm handshakes and Courtney's fake smiles. You knew DeAndre was weak enough to let them poison our legacy and steal our hard-earned foundation. But you did not leave me defenseless. You gave me the armor and the ammunition to fight back. I tightened my fist around the brass key, feeling its edges dig into my calloused skin. I promise you, Evie, I will not let them take a single inch of what we built. I am going to fiercely protect our history. I am going to burn their fraudulent empire down to the ashes, and I am going to make sure the entire world sees exactly what kind of monsters they truly are. I opened my eyes and slid the key back into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, keeping it securely close to my heart. The time for grieving was officially over. My encrypted burner phone buzzed with a single text message from Richard Gallagher. "It is time." I walked out of the penthouse and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. Gallagher was standing next to his sleek black luxury sedan, leaning casually against the polished door. He looked me up and down, taking in the bespoke suit and the rigid, uncompromising posture. He gave a slow, approving nod. "You look like a man ready to collect a major debt," Mr. Reed Gallagher said, his voice sharp. "I am collecting absolutely everything," I replied simply. I slid into the spacious back seat and Gallagher took the wheel. We navigated through the bustling morning traffic of downtown Atlanta, heading straight for the high-end legal district. The notary office was located inside a massive glass high-rise, a towering fortress of corporate law where the Kensingtons felt completely invincible. Gallagher pulled the sedan up to the main entrance, but he did not immediately turn off the engine. He checked his rearview mirror and smiled a sharp, highly predatory grin. "We have company, Mr. Reed." I turned my head and looked out the tinted back window. Pulling up directly behind our sedan were two massive unmarked black SUVs. The windows were completely blacked out and they lacked any civilian license plates. The heavy doors swung open in perfect unison. 4 men and 2 women stepped out onto the concrete sidewalk. They wore tactical vests over crisp dress shirts and carried heavy equipment belts clipped to their waists. Emblazoned across their chests in bright yellow block letters were the initials FBI. The federal agents did not pause or look around. They moved with swift, terrifying purpose, locking down the perimeter of the building. Gallagher stepped out of the sedan and opened my door, holding it wide. "The board is set, Alfonso," he said. I stepped out onto the pavement, adjusting my burgundy tie. The Kensingtons were waiting upstairs for a massive payday. I was bringing them a federal raid. The VIP conference room on the 40th floor of the legal high-rise was a monument to corporate excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Atlanta skyline, but the people inside the room were entirely focused on their own manufactured brilliance. William Kensington sat in a plush leather chair at the center of the massive glass table, tapping his solid gold watch with an air of immense impatience. He wore a smug expression, entirely convinced that today was the day he would permanently secure his financial empire using the blood and sweat of a man he considered utterly beneath him. Courtney sat next to him, sipping imported sparkling water from a crystal glass. She crossed her legs and admired her fresh manicure, looking every bit the wealthy heiress who had never worked a hard day in her life. She was already mentally calculating how quickly she could route the $3 million into her private accounts and flee the country. DeAndre paced nervously near the window. He was sweating through his silver suit, his mind consumed by the terrifying countdown of the shadow investors. He checked his phone every 30 seconds, desperately praying that his father would simply walk in, sign the papers, and make the nightmare go away. William let out a loud, arrogant sigh that echoed off the soundproof walls. "Your father is late. DeAndre?" William sneered, his voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. "I suppose we cannot expect punctuality from a man who spent his life punching a time clock. The working class simply has no concept of high-level financial deadlines." "Just be patient," Courtney added with a cruel, dismissive laugh. "He is probably struggling to figure out how the elevator works. Just smile and point to the dotted line when he finally shuffles in." DeAndre nodded weakly, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "He will be here," he muttered. "He needs this just as much as we do. He thinks he is saving me." They sat in their luxurious bubble, completely intoxicated by their own fabricated superiority. They had no idea the elevator rising toward their floor was not carrying a victim. It was carrying their absolute destruction. The heavy oak door of the conference room swung open with a sudden, forceful thrust. The quiet, arrogant chatter inside the room died instantly. William straightened his tie, expecting the dirty, hunched-over old man who had begged for change in the corporate lobby just days ago. Courtney placed her crystal glass on the table, arranging her face into a mask of fake, sympathetic sweetness. DeAndre turned away from the window, letting out a massive breath of relief that his salvation had finally arrived. But the man who stepped across the threshold was not a broken, elderly victim. I walked into the room with my head held high, my shoulders broad and square. The bespoke charcoal gray suit hugged my heavy frame with flawless precision. My black leather Oxfords clicked against the polished hardwood floor with a slow, rhythmic authority. I did not shuffle. I did not tremble. I moved with the undeniable weight of a patriarch who owned every single inch of the ground he walked on. The effect on the room was immediate and entirely catastrophic. DeAndre's jaw physically dropped. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he stared at me, unable to reconcile the pathetic weeping creature from the motel room with the towering titan standing before him. Courtney choked on the sparkling water she had just swallowed, coughing violently and grasping the edge of the glass table for support. Her fake smile shattered into a million pieces, revealing the pure, unfiltered terror hiding underneath. William Kensington froze. The smug, aristocratic superiority drained from his pale face in a single heartbeat. He recognized the suit, he recognized the posture, but more importantly, he recognized the cold, dead look in my eyes. It was the look of a man who knew absolutely everything. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not apologize for being late. I walked directly to the head of the conference table, the seat of ultimate power, and stood behind the high-backed leather chair. Richard Gallagher stepped into the room right behind me, his dark pinstripe suit and predatory gaze amplifying the suffocating tension. He stood silently at my right shoulder, a lethal legal weapon fully primed and ready to fire. I looked down at my son. I looked at his treacherous wife. I looked at the corrupt aristocrat who tried to steal my home. The silence in the room was so dense it felt like it could crush their skulls. William was a seasoned corporate shark. He had spent his entire life manipulating high-stakes boardrooms, and he desperately tried to salvage the rapidly collapsing situation. He forced a stiff, unnatural smile onto his face and stood up, buttoning his jacket in a frantic attempt to reclaim his lost authority. Alfonso, William said, his voice slightly higher and much faster than usual. "You clean up remarkably well. I must say this is a very pleasant surprise. We were expecting you to be a bit more fatigued given the recent tragedy. Please take a seat. Let us get right down to business. Time is money, as they say." William reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of freshly printed legal documents. His hands were shaking just enough to cause the heavy paper to rustle loudly in the quiet room. He slid the documents across the pristine glass table, pushing them directly toward my empty chair. He then produced an expensive gold pen and laid it carefully on top of the contract. "We have drawn up the deed transfer for the 50 acres down south," William explained, speaking rapidly to fill the terrifying silence. "To avoid the massive capital gains taxes you would normally face, we are routing the $3 million developer payout directly into the Kensington Primary Holding Trust. From there, I will personally manage the distribution to clear DeAndre's minor debts and set up a modest but comfortable living stipend for you. It is the smartest financial move, Alfonso. You just need to sign on the last page and we can all move forward." I looked down at the documents. It was a masterpiece of legal theft. If I signed that paper, the imaginary $3 million would instantly belong to him. He was trying to hustle me right to my face, acting as though he was doing me a massive favor. He was sweating now. I could see the damp patches forming under his arms. The federal freeze was choking his finances, and he needed this signature to survive. I did not touch the gold pen. I did not even look at the fraudulent contract. I kept my eyes locked entirely on him. I did not say a single word. I simply raised my right hand and gave a small, calculated nod to the man standing beside me. Richard Gallagher did not hesitate. He walked with slow, deliberate steps away from the table and headed straight for the heavy oak door we had just walked through. DeAndre watched him move, his eyes darting back and forth in total confusion. Gallagher reached the door, grasped the heavy brass deadbolt, and turned it hard. A loud, solid click echoed through the room, sealing us inside. He then calmly walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pulled the heavy blackout blinds tightly shut, plunging the luxurious conference room into an oppressive, suffocating shadow. "We are not here to sign your tax documents," Mr. Kensington Gallagher said, his voice a cold, lethal whisper that cut through the darkness. "We are here to settle a completely different account." Gallagher walked back to the center of the room. He reached inside his sleek leather briefcase. He did not pull out a property deed. He did not pull out a standard legal brief. He pulled out a thick, menacing stack of paper bound by a heavy black clip. He raised his arm and threw the document down onto the glass table with brutal force. It landed squarely on top of William's fraudulent transfer form, sliding directly in front of DeAndre's face. DeAndre looked down. The color vanished from his skin, leaving him looking like a ghost. He recognized the letterhead immediately. It was the predatory loan contract, the exact $500,000 bridge loan he had signed with the violent shadow investors just days ago, the document that promised 30% interest and severe bodily harm upon default. But the name of the creditor at the top of the page had been legally altered. Where the underground syndicate's name used to be, there was now a bold black stamp identifying the new owner of the debt. It was Evelyn's private offshore holding company. DeAndre looked up at me, his lips trembling in absolute terror. "That is my loan." He choked out, his voice barely a squeak. I leaned forward, resting my heavy hands on the glass table. I looked my son dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. "You do not owe the shadow investors anymore, DeAndre," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying rumble. "You owe me, and I am collecting today." DeAndre stared down at the thick stack of paper resting on the glass table. His eyes locked onto the bold black ink stamped across the top of the contract. The name of the violent underground syndicate was crossed out. In its place sat the formal legal title of his late mother's private offshore holding company. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of cold ash. He reached out with trembling fingers and traced the letters as if hoping it was a cruel optical illusion. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. The terrifying shadow investors, the men he thought were coming to break his legs and throw him in the river, were completely gone. The crippling $600,000 debt had not simply vanished. It had been purchased. The predator holding the leash to his absolute financial and physical ruin was not a faceless criminal. It was the man standing directly across the table. DeAndre looked up from the contract. His eyes traveled over the impeccable bespoke suit, the polished Oxfords, and the unyielding, rigid posture of the father he had so foolishly underestimated. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation crashed down upon him like a concrete slab. He had spent the last month trying to hustle a man who was quietly buying up the deed to his very soul. "I bought your paper, DeAndre," I said. My voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated against the glass walls of the conference room. "I used your mother's clean offshore capital to pay the shadow investors a massive premium. They gladly took the cash and legally assigned every single clause, every penalty, and every brutal condition of that extortionate contract directly to me. I am your sole creditor now." DeAndre stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I shifted my gaze toward Courtney, who was currently pressing her back against the expensive leather chair, looking as though she wanted to sink through the floorboards. "Look at your wife, DeAndre," I commanded, pointing a heavy finger at her trembling frame. "Look at the woman you sold your own mother's house to impress. You were so desperate to fit into her aristocratic world that you allowed her to put a noose completely around your neck." I slammed my hand down onto the table, making the crystal water glasses rattle violently. "She held your hand while you forged my signature on that commercial loan," I stated, mapping out the exact anatomy of their treachery. "She whispered sweet promises in your ear while she convinced you to illegally funnel $500,000 of my equity directly into her father's failing trust account. They used you as a disposable money mule. They needed a fool to take the federal risk while they pocketed the cash. And the very second the federal government froze that trust account, what did your loving wife do? She packed her designer bags, fled your home, and left a typed note on the kitchen counter telling you to face the violent debt collectors entirely alone." DeAndre slowly turned his head to look at Courtney. His expression was completely shattered. Courtney refused to meet his eyes, staring intensely at her lap. "You wanted white elite validation so badly you handed them the knife to carve you up," I continued, stripping away the last remaining shreds of his corporate arrogance. "You thought you were the mastermind pulling off a high-stakes real estate scam against a senile old black man. You thought throwing me into a damp basement was the price of admission to their country club. But they never respected you, DeAndre. They looked at you and saw a convenient scapegoat. They fully planned to call the authorities the moment the cash cleared and testify that you acted completely alone. They were going to send you to a federal penitentiary for 2 decades and walk away with your entire inheritance." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. DeAndre looked physically sick, leaning heavily against the table to keep his legs from giving out. I looked at the boy I had raised and felt the final lingering embers of my paternal warmth extinguish completely, leaving only cold, hardened steel. "I spent 25 years operating heavy machinery in the blistering Georgia heat," I told him, my voice echoing with the weight of decades of backbreaking labor. "I breathed in diesel fumes and dirt. My joints ached every single morning before the sun even came up. Your mother sat at our kitchen table late into the night, meticulously balancing ledgers and guarding every single penny we earned. We built a fortress for you. We paid for private academies and elite universities so you would never have to break your back in the red clay. We gave you a flawless foundation." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. "But you learned the exact wrong lesson. You looked at our calloused hands and you felt ashamed. You thought our honest blue-collar dirt was a stain on your newly purchased luxury image. You decided to trade a solid concrete foundation for a fragile house of cards built entirely on fraud, lies, and stolen money. But your mother was a tactical genius. Evelyn saw the weakness in your character long before I was willing to admit it. She knew you were desperate enough to let these vultures drain our legacy. That is exactly why she planted the poison pill in the property deed. She built a legal firewall to protect our history from your pathetic ambition." I gestured to the predatory loan contract sitting in front of him. "Betrayal has a devastating price, DeAndre. You thought the underground syndicate was going to ruin you. I am going to break your entire reality. I am foreclosing on everything you own. You will walk out of this city with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back." A sharp, arrogant scoff suddenly broke through the heavy tension in the room. William Kensington pushed his chair back and stood up, adjusting his pristine suit jacket with an air of complete and utter dismissal. He looked around the room with a sneer of profound aristocratic disgust. "Well, this has certainly been a fascinating display of lower-class family drama," William said, his voice dripping with venomous contempt. "It is exactly the kind of emotional squalor I would expect from people of your background. But my daughter and I have actual legitimate business to attend to." He reached down and snapped his leather briefcase shut. "Whatever disastrous financial decisions your son made and whatever underground debts he now owes you are completely his own problem. The Kensington family is officially washing its hands of this entire pathetic spectacle." William looked down at Courtney and snapped his fingers. "Let us go, Courtney. We are leaving these people to their mud. Your marriage to this liability is officially over." Courtney scrambled out of her chair, grabbing her purse and rushing to stand safely behind her father's broad shoulders. William gave me one final mocking smirk, completely convinced that his wealth and status made him untouchable. He confidently walked toward the heavy oak door, expecting Richard Gallagher to scramble out of his way like a subservient employee. Gallagher did not flinch. He maintained his cold, predatory smile and smoothly stepped aside. He reached out, grasped the heavy brass deadbolt, and turned it with a loud, satisfying click, unlocking the door for the arrogant patriarch. William gripped the polished handle and pulled the heavy door open, preparing to march back into his elite world of privilege and power. He took exactly one step forward before he froze entirely in his tracks. Standing in the brightly lit hallway, completely blocking the exit, was a solid wall of tactical body armor. 4 federal agents stood in perfect formation, their faces stern and unyielding. The bright yellow letters reading FBI were highly visible across their chests. 2 more agents stood further down the corridor, securing the elevator banks. William Kensington, a firm, authoritative voice, commanded. The lead agent stepped directly into the doorway, holding a thick stack of warrants featuring a prominent federal seal. He raised his hand, flashing a gold badge that caught the fluorescent light. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and federal banking violations." The lead FBI agent stepped squarely into the doorway, completely blocking William Kensington's escape path. William stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor. He bumped into the heavy oak frame, his briefcase hitting the ground with a dull, heavy thud. "This is a massive misunderstanding," William stammered, his voice entirely stripped of its usual commanding tone. "I am a highly respected wealth manager in this city. You have the wrong man. You need to step aside and let me contact my legal counsel immediately." The lead agent did not blink. He did not move a single inch. He held up a thick stack of federal warrants stamped with the official seal of the United States government. "We have exactly the right man," the agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone. "William Kensington, you are under federal arrest. We have secured warrants for your properties, your corporate offices, and your offshore holding accounts. We are officially charging you with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international money laundering, and severe violations of federal banking laws." William looked frantically up and down the brightly lit hallway. He saw the other heavily armed agents securing the elevator banks and the emergency exits. There was no secret VIP exit. There was no country club handshake that could make this disappear. The impenetrable fortress of his white elite privilege was rapidly collapsing around him. He turned back toward the conference room, looking desperately at Richard Gallagher. "You are a lawyer," William practically begged. "Tell them they cannot do this. Tell them they need a subpoena." Gallagher simply smiled, adjusting his pinstripe suit. "They already have the subpoenas," Mr. Kensington Gallagher replied coldly. "In fact, they have an absolute mountain of undeniable evidence, and you can thank the man standing right in front of you for delivering it directly to the director's desk." I stepped forward, leaving the head of the glass table and walking slowly toward the terrified aristocrat. I held a sleek digital tablet in my hand provided by Gallagher and loaded with every single piece of forensic accounting my late wife had meticulously gathered. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. The truth was deafening enough. My wife Evelyn was a master accountant, I said, my heavy boots coming to a halt just a few feet away from his trembling frame. When she found out she was dying, she did not sit in bed and cry. She spent her final agonizing weeks tracking every single fraudulent dime you stole from my family. She left me the key to safety deposit box 402. Inside that box was your absolute destruction. I tapped the screen of the tablet and held it up for him to see. The bright digital display showed the exact routing numbers, the shell company records, and the forged loan agreements. You thought you were an untouchable financial genius, William, but you left a paper trail a mile wide. You coerced my desperate son into forging my signature and his mother's signature on a $500,000 commercial mortgage. That is federal mortgage fraud. But you did not stop there. You needed clean liquid cash to bail out your own failing investments. So you routed that stolen $500,000 through a fake corporate entity and deposited it directly into your primary family trust account. That is international money laundering and federal wire fraud. I swiped the screen, bringing up a new document. And just to make sure the federal investigators had absolute zero doubt about your intentions, I sent them the audio recordings from your private vehicle. They have the crystal clear tapes of you driving through the suburbs with your daughter, explicitly outlining your plan to frame DeAndre for the entire scheme. They heard you laughing about sending my son to a federal penitentiary so you could keep the stolen money and walk away with clean hands. You did not just commit a white-collar financial crime. You orchestrated a malicious, predatory conspiracy to destroy a black family to save your own pathetic status. The federal agents standing in the hallway already have every single file, every bank statement, and every audio clip. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network verified the offshore routing algorithms this morning. You are not going to a country club prison, William. You are going to a maximum security federal facility. The pristine mask of the wealthy white aristocrat completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. The sophisticated vocabulary and the condescending smirk evaporated entirely. William Kensington, the man who had looked at me with pure disgust just 10 minutes ago, transformed into a cornered, desperate animal. His face turned a violent shade of crimson, and sweat poured down his forehead, soaking into the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt. "It is a lie," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger at DeAndre. "He did it. The boy did it. He forged the signatures because he is a degenerate gambler. He owed hundreds of thousands to underground syndicates. He begged me to help him hide the money. I am the victim here. He stole from his own father to pay for his violent lifestyle. I knew nothing about the forged documents. You have to believe me." William lunged forward, trying to grab the tablet from my hands, but I stood completely still like a concrete pillar. His frantic, desperate energy crashed against my absolute resolve, and he stumbled backward. His chest heaved as he hyperventilated. The composed, wealthy patriarch was gone. He looked pathetic. He looked weak. He looked exactly like a man who knew he was about to spend the rest of his natural life locked inside a tiny concrete box. The illusion of his generational wealth and superiority had been stripped away, leaving nothing but a cowardly thief who was perfectly willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone to save his own skin. The lead FBI agent had heard enough. He stepped fully into the conference room, closing the distance between himself and the frantic millionaire in 2 rapid strides. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the agent commanded, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. William tried to back away, but 2 more agents flanked him instantly. They grabbed his arms with practiced, relentless force, twisting them behind his back. The sharp, metallic sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed off the glass walls. It was the absolute loudest sound in the entire room. It was the sound of a fake empire being permanently dismantled. Seeing her father physically subdued by federal agents completely broke Courtney. The arrogant heiress who had sneered at my worn-out work boots and thrown a $50 bill at my face lost her mind. She let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream that pierced the air. "No!" she shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "You cannot do this! Do you know who we are? We are the Kensingtons. You cannot arrest him." She rushed forward, desperately clawing at the agent's broad shoulders, trying to pull them away from her father. One of the female agents smoothly intercepted her, grabbing Courtney by the shoulders and shoving her back against the glass table with a firm warning to stand down. Courtney collapsed against the edge of the table, sobbing uncontrollably. Her flawless makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Her designer dress was completely rumpled. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting from her handcuffed father to the federal agents and finally landing on me. But the real explosion was still waiting to happen. Because Courtney was about to realize that she was not just a spectator in this federal takedown. She was standing directly on the blast radius. Courtney stared at the heavy steel cuffs binding her father's wrists. The reality of the situation fractured her perfectly curated world into jagged, unrecognizable pieces. The untouchable Kensington patriarch was being treated like a common street criminal right in front of her eyes. She pushed herself off the edge of the glass conference table, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The tears that had been streaming down her face just moments ago suddenly dried up. The desperate, hysterical daughter vanished completely, replaced by a cornered, venomous animal fighting for its own survival. The aristocratic loyalty she always boasted about extended only as far as her own personal safety. When the ship started sinking, she did not hesitate to throw the nearest person overboard. Courtney whipped her head around and locked her eyes on DeAndre. He was still standing near the window, trembling in his silver suit, looking completely lost. Courtney raised her arm, extending a trembling, perfectly manicured finger straight at her husband's chest. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, malicious survival. It was him, she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. She looked directly at the lead FBI agent, her eyes wide and pleading. "You are arresting the wrong man. My father is completely innocent. We had absolutely no idea what he was doing. DeAndre is the one who forged the signatures. He is the criminal. He orchestrated this entire fraud behind our backs." DeAndre flinched as if she had physically struck him. He took a small, uncertain step forward, reaching out a hand toward his wife. "Courtney, what are you saying?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "We did this together. You told me to sign those papers." "Do not speak to me!" Courtney shrieked, taking a dramatic step backward, as if his mere presence disgusted her. She turned her full attention back to the federal agents, weaving a rapid, desperate web of absolute lies. She played the ultimate victim card, relying heavily on the dark racial and class dynamics she knew operated in the world. "He manipulated us," she cried out, pointing accusingly at DeAndre. "He came into our family pretending to be a successful corporate executive, but he was drowning in secret debts. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to violent underground syndicates. He was terrified. He used his position to intercept my father's legitimate business documents. He forged his own parents' signatures on that $500,000 mortgage because he knew they were vulnerable. He stole the money, and then he tricked my father. He told us he had secured a massive corporate bonus and wanted to invest it in our family trust to prove his loyalty. My father simply accepted a financial transfer from his son-in-law. We did not know the money was stolen from his own father. We are victims of his deception. She was completely ruthless. She was rewriting the entire history of their marriage in real time, painting DeAndre as a predatory, deceitful thug who had preyed upon her wealthy, innocent family. She did not stop there. She piled on the character assassination, digging the blade deeper into her husband's back. He was abusive and controlling, she sobbed, producing a fresh wave of fake tears for the agents. He handled all the banking. He forced me to sign documents without reading them. When the federal freeze happened, he lost his mind. He told me if I did not help him cover it up, he would let his loan shark friends come after me. I only fled his house because I feared for my physical safety. He is a monster. You need to arrest him and let my father go. William Kensington stood silently in his handcuffs, nodding along with his daughter's treacherous performance. He was perfectly willing to let his daughter feed her husband to the federal machine if it meant saving his own skin. The grand illusion of their perfect high society marriage was officially shattered, exposing the rotting, decaying core underneath. DeAndre did not scream. He did not defend himself. He stood completely frozen, anchored to the hardwood floor by the sheer paralyzing weight of his own profound stupidity. The shock of Courtney's betrayal paralyzed his vocal cords. He stared at the woman he had loved, the woman he had sold his soul to impress, and he finally saw her clearly for the very first time. The elegant designer dress and the refined upper-class accent faded away, revealing a cold, calculating parasite. She did not love him. She had never loved him. He was nothing more than an accessory to her lifestyle and a convenient scapegoat for her crimes. DeAndre slowly turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide, raw, and hollowed out by absolute despair. In that single devastating moment, every terrible choice he had made crashed down upon him. He realized what he had traded for this poisonous illusion. He had looked at my calloused hands, the hands that worked double shifts to pay his private school tuition, and felt embarrassment. He had looked at his mother's meticulous financial planning and felt burdened. He had willingly handed over the title to his childhood home, the very foundation of his family legacy, just to buy a seat at a table with people who were currently begging the federal government to lock him in a cage. He had thrown away a father who would have taken a bullet for him to marry a woman who was actively pulling the trigger. The crushing realization physically crumpled him. His shoulders slumped, his chest hollowed out, and he looked exactly like the broken, ruined man he had become. The fantasy world he sacrificed his family to join was currently ripping him to shreds while he stood there utterly defenseless. The lead FBI agent listened to Courtney's entire hysterical performance without interrupting. He let her spin her desperate web of lies until she finally ran out of breath. When she stopped sobbing and looked at him, expecting sympathy, the agent simply turned to Richard Gallagher. Gallagher did not say a word. He merely picked up the sleek digital tablet from the glass table and tapped the screen once. The crisp, clear audio of Courtney's own voice filled the silent conference room. It was the recording from Williams' luxury SUV captured just yesterday afternoon. "We use a fraction of the new money to erase the loan shark debt," Courtney's recorded voice echoed loudly off the glass walls. "But the forged mortgage documents are still sitting in a commercial bank. The moment the $3 million clears into our accounts, I am calling the FBI director myself. I will hand over the forged papers and tell them DeAndre acted alone to steal from his own father. He goes to federal prison, and we walk away with his entire family inheritance." Courtney's face turned bone white. The color drained from her lips as she heard her own treacherous words played back in brilliant high definition. The fake tears stopped instantly. She looked wildly around the room, realizing she had just walked directly into a completely inescapable trap. Every single lie she had just told the federal agents was utterly dismantled by her own recorded confession. The female FBI agent who had pushed Courtney back earlier stepped forward, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. "Courtney Kensington," the agent said, her voice sharp and unforgiving, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and serving as a direct accomplice to international money laundering." The agent grabbed Courtney's wrists and twisted them roughly behind her back. The steel cuffs ratcheted shut, locking the wealthy heiress in place next to her father. The sheer absolute humiliation of being chained like a common criminal washed over her. She did not scream, she did not fight, she just stared at the floor, completely destroyed, knowing she would have to be marched out of the corporate high-rise in front of all her elite peers in handcuffs. The female FBI agent pulled Courtney up by her arms with a forceful, unyielding tug. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a sudden primal panic. Courtney began to thrash violently against the heavy steel restraints. "You cannot do this to me!" she screamed, her voice echoing like a siren down the immaculate corridors of the 40th floor. The agents flanked her, and William marching them firmly toward the heavy glass doors of the suite. Courtney dug her designer heels deep into the plush corporate carpet, refusing to walk and forcing the federal agents to physically drag her forward. Her flawless, immaculate facade was completely obliterated. She wailed a shrill, guttural sound that bounced harshly off the polished marble walls. "Daddy, tell them to stop. Do something!" She shrieked, tears and ruined expensive makeup smearing across her pale face. But William Kensington marched in stunned silence, his head bowed, the arrogant fight entirely drained from his aristocratic frame. As they pushed her through the glass partitions into the main reception area, Courtney's screams grew more desperate and entirely unhinged. She kicked and thrashed like a spoiled child denied a prize, but the agents moved with a practiced, cold efficiency. The sound of her frantic sobbing filled the air entirely, disrupting the hushed professional atmosphere of the corporate high-rise. This was not a quiet, dignified, white-collar arrest negotiated behind closed doors. It was a loud, messy, and brutally public display of her complete downfall. She pleaded with the agents, promising them money, threatening them with massive lawsuits, and finally resorting to pathetic, breathy begs for mercy. The steel cuffs dug sharply into her wrists, a cold, heavy reminder that her trust fund and her family name held absolutely no power here. Every scream she let out only amplified the pathetic reality of her situation. The elevator descended rapidly, plunging them into the grand sunlit atrium of the legal fortress. This was the exact place where the Kensington family had brokered multi-million-dollar deals and hosted lavish corporate galas for decades. The massive lobby was currently bustling with elite partners, high-profile clients, and wealthy socialites making their morning rounds. When the elevator doors slid open, revealing William and Courtney flanked by armed federal agents, the entire atrium ground to a devastating halt. The quiet hum of networking and power brokering died instantly, replaced by a thick, stunned silence. Dozens of eyes turned to witness the unprecedented spectacle. Courtney stumbled out of the elevator, her face a horrific mess of running mascara and snot, her wrists locked securely behind her back. She locked eyes with a group of senior partners from a rival wealth management firm. The men and women she had sipped expensive champagne with just a week ago now stared at her with a mixture of profound shock and thinly veiled disgust. Whispers erupted across the polished marble floor, spreading like a violent wildfire. "Is that William Kensington?" someone murmured. "Federal agents," another voice noted loud enough for the acoustics to carry across the room. William tried to maintain a shred of his dignity, keeping his chin up and staring straight ahead, but the visible steel handcuffs shattered any illusion of control. He was being paraded through his own kingdom like a defeated, captured traitor. Courtney, however, could not handle the intense, judging stares. She tried to hide her face behind her disheveled blonde hair, sobbing uncontrollably as she was marched past the massive front reception desk. The very people who used to kiss the ground she walked on were now pulling out their smartphones, capturing every humiliating second of her perp walk. The Kensington name, built on decades of carefully curated lies, false prestige, and predatory wealth, was being ground directly into the marble floor. Their honor was not just bruised, it was completely and permanently crushed. In the span of a single morning walk through a crowded corporate lobby, they went from royalty to social pariahs. They would never be invited to another gala. They would never sit in another boardroom. The elite world they worshipped had already excommunicated them before they even reached the revolving glass doors. Back on the 40th floor, DeAndre stood frozen in the exact spot where his wife had just tried to sentence him to a federal prison. His mind was struggling to process the sheer velocity of the destruction. The woman he loved, the woman he had forged his own parents' signatures for, had just been dragged away in handcuffs after explicitly begging the FBI to lock him in a cage. But old habits and deep-seated trauma are hard to break. A sudden, irrational panic seized him. He watched the elevator doors close behind Courtney, and a desperate, pathetic instinct took over his body. "Courtney," he choked out, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He lunged forward, his expensive silver suit wrinkling as he sprinted toward the glass doors of the conference room. He wanted to chase after her, to ask her why she lied, to somehow salvage the broken fragments of his fabricated life. He burst into the upper hallway, his breath ragged, reaching out his hand toward the empty elevator bank. "Wait!" he yelled, his voice echoing pathetically down the corridor. But before he could take another step toward the elevators, the two remaining federal agents stepped firmly into his path. One agent raised a broad, unyielding hand, pressing it squarely against DeAndre's chest and shoving him backward with a forceful, heavy thrust. "Stay exactly where you are, sir," the agent commanded, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. DeAndre stumbled backward, his leather shoes slipping on the polished floor. He hit the wall, sliding down slightly as the absolute finality of the situation crushed the remaining air from his lungs. His wife was gone. His father-in-law was gone. His entire upper-class fantasy had just vanished behind a set of closing steel doors, leaving him completely exposed and entirely vulnerable. DeAndre slowly pulled himself off the hallway wall. He was trembling violently, his chest heaving with dry, silent sobs. The federal agents gave him a cold, dismissive look before turning to secure the perimeter, making it abundantly clear that he was not worth their time. He was not the mastermind. He was just the collateral damage left in the wake of the raid. Defeated, stripped of his corporate arrogance, and utterly broken, DeAndre turned around and dragged his feet back toward the VIP conference room. He placed a shaking hand on the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The bright artificial lights of the room illuminated the stark, horrifying reality of his existence. The loud, arrogant energy of the Kensington family was completely gone. The room was deathly quiet. Sitting at the head of the massive glass table was me, his father, perfectly composed in my bespoke charcoal suit, my hands resting steadily on the glass. Standing right beside me was Richard Gallagher, the ruthless architect of this entire financial ambush. DeAndre stepped inside, and the heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing him inside the room. He looked at me, his eyes hollow red and brimming with unadulterated fear. He had no powerful father-in-law to hide behind. He had no manipulative wife to whisper instructions in his ear. He had no fake corporate status, no shadow investors, and absolutely nowhere left to run. He was standing entirely alone, completely isolated, staring directly at the man he had betrayed. The man who now held the absolute legal and financial power to decide whether he lived a free man or died a prisoner. DeAndre swallowed hard, the silence wrapping around his throat like a vice. There was no one left to save him. The heavy oak door of the conference room was firmly shut, sealing the three of us inside a tomb of absolute silence. DeAndre stood frozen near the threshold. His eyes darted wildly around the empty space where his arrogant wife and his powerful father-in-law had sat just moments before. The reality of his complete isolation finally broke whatever fragile mechanism was holding his mind together. His knees gave out. He did not simply sit down, he collapsed. His expensive silver suit crumpled as he hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, pathetic thud. He crawled across the short distance separating us, his tailored trousers dragging against the floorboards. He reached my chair and threw his arms around my legs, burying his tear-soaked face into the fabric of my bespoke trousers. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice a high-pitched, agonizing sound that completely stripped away his corporate dignity. "Please forgive me. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry." His grip was tight, fueled by the sheer animal terror of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing on the edge of a massive, bottomless cliff. He sobbed uncontrollably, his tears soaking right through the heavy Italian wool of my suit. He looked like a beggar pleading for his life. The polished vice president of logistics, the man who thought he could outsmart a blue-collar worker and steal $500,000, had been reduced to a weeping, trembling mess on the floor of a downtown legal office. He had no shadow investors chasing him anymore, but the creditor standing before him was far more terrifying. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually on the edge of the glass table, allowing him to cry, allowing him to feel the absolute crushing weight of his profound failure. DeAndre gasped for air, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. He scrambled to find the words to justify the monstrous crimes he had committed against his own blood. "It was them, Dad," he cried out, pointing a shaking finger toward the empty chairs where the Kensingtons had been sitting. "They made me do it. Courtney and William manipulated me from the very beginning. They brainwashed me. They made me feel like I was never good enough for their family unless I provided massive amounts of capital." He wiped his nose with the back of his expensive silk sleeve, completely abandoning any shred of professional decorum. "William told me his investments were tied up and he just needed a temporary bridge loan. Courtney threatened to leave me if I did not secure the funds immediately. They forced my hand, Dad. I never wanted to forge your signature on that commercial mortgage. I never wanted to put a lien on your house. They told me it was just a technicality and that they would pay it right back with interest. They used my love for Courtney to trap me." The words spilled out of his mouth in a frantic, desperate flood. He was trying to rewrite history, placing himself as the helpless victim of a white, aristocratic conspiracy rather than a willing, greedy participant. "They told me you were getting old, Dad," he sobbed, his voice cracking with manufactured grief. "They convinced me you were losing your mind and that we needed to step in and take control of the estate for your own protection. I was confused. I was scared of losing my wife. I just wanted to be part of their world and they exploited that weakness. Please, Dad, you have to believe me. I am your son. I am your only son. I was manipulated. I was just trying to keep my marriage from falling apart. I did not mean to hurt you or Mom." He gripped my legs even tighter, pressing his wet face against my knees, desperately trying to evoke the paternal instinct he had spent the last 3 years utterly disrespecting. He thought a few tears and a fabricated story of psychological manipulation would magically erase the cold, hard fact that he had actively planned to send me to a damp basement while he stole my entire life savings. I looked down at the top of his head, watching his shoulders shake with every pathetic sob. As I stared at him, my mind involuntarily pulled up a memory from over 30 years ago. I saw a bright-eyed 5-year-old boy standing in the driveway of our small suburban home. I had just come back from a grueling 14-hour shift operating heavy machinery in the suffocating summer heat. My hands were covered in grease and my boots were caked in red clay. That little boy had run full speed across the grass, throwing his tiny arms around my dirty legs, looking up at me with absolute unconditional adoration. He used to wear my oversized hard hat and proudly tell the neighbors that his father was the strongest man in the world. I remembered how hard Evelyn and I worked to protect that boy's innocence. I remembered the back-breaking sacrifices we made specifically so he would never have to compromise his integrity just to survive in a harsh world. We bought him the best education so he could sit in these glass towers with pride. But as I looked down at the weeping 38-year-old man currently clinging to my trousers, that nostalgic image completely evaporated. The innocent 5-year-old boy from my memory was dead. This man kneeling on the floor had murdered him. The creature crying at my feet had chosen arrogance over loyalty. He had chosen fake elite status over his own mother's legacy. He did not forge those signatures because he was brainwashed. He forged them because he was greedy. He looked at the foundation his parents built and saw nothing but a piggy bank to fund his pathetic country club fantasies. The son I raised would never have sold his soul to impress people who looked down on his heritage. The man sobbing in front of me was an absolute stranger and a highly dangerous one. The silence in the room stretched out cold and unforgiving. DeAndre continued to weep, waiting for the warm, comforting hand of a forgiving father to rest gently on his shoulder. He expected me to bend down, lift him off the floor, and tell him that everything was going to be all right. He expected the endless grace of a man who had always bailed him out of trouble since he was a teenager. But that man was buried right next to Evelyn. I slowly reached down and firmly grasped DeAndre by the wrists. My heavy, calloused hands clamped around his arms like industrial steel vices. I did not lift him up. I violently shoved his hands away from my body, breaking his grip completely, and took a deliberate, heavy step backward. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice a low, terrifying growl that instantly silenced his sobbing. DeAndre fell forward, his hands catching his weight against the hardwood floor. He looked up at me in absolute shock. "There is no manipulation powerful enough to make a real man forge his dying mother's signature," I said, staring down at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You were not a victim, DeAndre. You were a willing volunteer. You threw me to the wolves because you thought I was too old and stupid to realize what you were doing. You let your aristocratic wife throw $50 in my face in a public lobby while you stood in absolute silence. You actively participated in a scheme to legally declare me insane so you could steal the roof over my head." I adjusted my suit jacket, my face entirely devoid of any mercy or forgiveness. "You made your choice when you signed that fraudulent commercial loan. You made your choice when you signed a contract with violent shadow investors. You made your choice when you handed my legacy over to William Kensington." I stared at his terrified face, ensuring he understood exactly what was coming next. "And now you are going to face the absolute consequences of those choices." Richard Gallagher stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the conference room. He moved with the precise, calculated grace of a surgeon about to make the final incision. He placed his sleek leather briefcase flat on the glass table and snapped the golden latches open. The sound echoed like a gunshot, causing DeAndre to flinch violently on the floor. Gallagher reached inside and produced two distinct legal documents, placing them side by side on the polished glass surface. He smoothed the thick pages down and uncapped a heavy silver fountain pen. Mr. Reed Gallagher began, his voice entirely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "Your father has instructed me to offer you a singular, non-negotiable choice today. You will listen very carefully because your entire future depends on what you do in the next 5 minutes." He tapped the first document with the tip of the silver pen. "This is a formal affidavit of non-prosecution. It is a legally binding declaration from your father's estate officially declining to press criminal charges against you for the fraudulent commercial mortgage. Since your father has acquired the predatory loan from the shadow investors and absorbed the financial damage, the primary victim of your identity theft is no longer the commercial bank. The primary victim is Alfonso Reed. If your father signs this document, he informs the federal authorities that the internal family debt has been completely settled. The FBI will not pursue you for the forged signatures. You will not share a federal prison cell with William Kensington." DeAndre stared at the affidavit, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. A brief flicker of hope ignited in his hollow eyes. He looked up at me, believing that his tears had actually worked. He thought I was bailing him out again, just like I had done when he was a careless teenager. He thought the nightmare was ending, but Gallagher immediately tapped the second document, completely extinguishing that pathetic spark of hope. However, Gallagher continued, his tone dropping to a lethal register. "This affidavit of non-prosecution is entirely contingent upon your immediate execution of this second document. This is a master asset forfeiture and total transfer agreement. The predatory loan you signed with the underground syndicate carried a $600,000 balance with an immediate default clause. You defaulted the second you failed to produce the capital. Your father is now enforcing that default to the absolute maximum extent of the law." I stepped closer to the table, looking down at the man who had sold my legacy. "I am saving you from a federal penitentiary, DeAndre," I said, my voice hard as concrete, "but I am not doing it because I forgive you. I am doing it because I refuse to let my own flesh and blood wear a bright orange jumpsuit on national television. I am saving you from the FBI, but I am completely destroying your financial existence. I am foreclosing on your entire life. I pointed a heavy calloused finger at the forfeiture agreement. You are going to sign over the deed to your luxury downtown condo, I commanded, dictating the terms of his absolute ruin. You are going to sign over the title to that expensive imported car you drove here today. You are surrendering your corporate investment portfolios, your checking accounts, and your emergency savings. Every single asset you acquired while pretending to be a wealthy aristocrat is being seized today to satisfy your debt to me. DeAndre stared at the paperwork in total disbelief. He slowly pulled himself up from the floor, leaning his shaking hands against the glass table. "Dad, you cannot do this," he whispered, his voice breaking into a dry, terrified rasp. "If I sign that I will have absolutely nothing, I will be completely bankrupt. Where am I supposed to live? How am I supposed to get to work?" "You are taking everything I own. I am taking back what you stole," I corrected him sharply. "You put my house on the line to fund a fake upper-class fantasy. Now your fantasy is over. The condo, the car, the watches, the designer suits, they were all bought with dirty money and massive leverage. You do not own any of it, DeAndre. You never did. You are going to sign that paper right now, or Gallagher will walk out of this room, hand the forged mortgage files to the federal agents waiting by the elevators, and you will be in handcuffs before you can even blink." DeAndre looked at Gallagher, who stared back with cold, unblinking eyes, perfectly ready to execute the threat. DeAndre looked at the heavy silver pen resting on the glass. His hands trembled violently as he reached for it. He knew he had absolutely no leverage. He was cornered, entirely trapped by his own catastrophic greed. He picked up the pen and pressed the tip to the paper. A single tear fell from his cheek and splashed against the heavy cardstock as he signed his name on the dotted line. He signed away his condo. He signed away his car. He signed away his entire bank account. In a matter of seconds, the wealthy corporate vice president was officially reduced to absolute zero. Gallagher swiftly pulled the signed documents away, placing them securely inside his leather briefcase. He handed DeAndre the affidavit of non-prosecution signed by me, guaranteeing his freedom from federal prison. DeAndre held the single piece of paper, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had his freedom, but it was a hollow, terrifying freedom. He was standing in a bespoke silver suit, but he was officially a homeless man. He looked up at me, his face a mask of complete devastation. "What am I supposed to do now, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I looked at him and felt the absolute finality of the moment settle over my shoulders. I was no longer his protector. I was no longer his safety net. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket and delivered the final absolute truth. "You wanted to sit at the big tables," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 40 years of hard labor. "You wanted to sip expensive champagne with the elite and look down on the working class. You thought the dirt on my boots was a sign of weakness. You thought the calluses on my hands were something to be ashamed of. You wanted to be a high-class aristocrat so badly that you sold your own soul to a family of venomous snakes." I stepped right into his personal space, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "Well, the elite world just chewed you up and spit you out," I told him. "You have no money. You have no property. You do not even have a car to drive home in. If you want to build a real life, you are going to do it the exact same way I did. You want to be high-class DeAndre. Then you need to learn how the foundation is actually poured. You are going to start from the absolute bottom. You are going to start from the gutter." I pointed toward the heavy oak door. "Leave the keys to the condo and the car on the table I ordered. You are evicted effective immediately. You are not going back to pack your designer clothes. You are not going back to collect your expensive watches. You are walking out of this building with exactly what you have on your back." DeAndre slowly reached into his pocket. His hand shook as he pulled out the heavy metal key fob for his imported car and the electronic key card for his luxury penthouse. He placed them gently on the glass table. The metallic clink sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. He took a staggering step backward, looking at me with eyes that begged for a final ounce of mercy. He found absolutely none. My expression was carved from solid stone. "Get out," I commanded. DeAndre turned around. His shoulders were completely slumped, his posture entirely shattered. He dragged his feet across the polished hardwood floor, walking like a man marching toward the gallows. He reached the heavy oak door, grabbed the brass handle, and pulled it open. He did not look back. He stepped out into the brightly lit hallway and the heavy door clicked shut behind him with a firm, definitive thud. I stood in the quiet conference room and watched through the narrow gap in the blinds as the security cameras captured his exit. DeAndre walked slowly down the long, immaculate corridor of the legal high-rise. The beautiful corporate architecture stood in stark, mocking contrast to his completely ruined life. He walked past the spot where his wife had been dragged away in steel handcuffs just minutes prior. The woman he loved had tried to send him to prison to save herself. The father-in-law he idolized had treated him like disposable garbage. The massive fortune he tried to steal had evaporated into thin air. He had traded his father's unconditional love for a toxic illusion, and now the illusion was entirely gone. He reached the elevator bank and pressed the down button. He stood there shivering in his expensive silver suit, a ghost of a man stripped of his entire identity. He had no wife to go home to. He had no money to buy a meal. He had no honor left to his name. And most devastating of all, he no longer had a family. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing slowly, separating him from the world he so desperately tried to conquer. He was descending back down to the ground floor, plunging straight into the cold, unforgiving reality of the gutter. I left the corporate high-rise and rode back to the suburbs in the quiet comfort of Gallagher's luxury sedan. When I finally pulled into the long driveway of my own home, the late afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the pristine front lawn. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. The air in the house felt fundamentally different. For the past 3 years, this space had been suffocated by Courtney's imported perfumes, her arrogant daily demands, and DeAndre's desperate, pathetic attempts to appease her. Now the air was perfectly still and remarkably clean. While the federal raid was tearing down the Kensington Empire downtown, I had instructed Gallagher's private security team to conduct a complete and thorough sweep of my property. They had systematically removed every single trace of my son and his treacherous wife. Courtney's expensive designer coats were entirely gone from the hallway closet. DeAndre's custom golf clubs had been cleared from the garage. The pretentious modern art pieces they had forced onto the living room walls, replacing our cherished family photos, had been taken down and tossed directly into the metal dumpster out back. The house was completely and unequivocally mine again. I walked through the empty rooms, listening to the steady, solid rhythm of my own boots hitting the hardwood floors. There was no more walking on eggshells in my own hallways. There was no more biting my tongue while guests who looked down on my heritage drank my expensive liquor and plotted my financial demise. The damp concrete basement where they had cruelly intended to banish me remained dark and empty. I stood in the center of the massive living room and took a deep, long breath, letting the absolute pristine silence wash over me. It was not the heavy, lonely silence of a grieving, defeated widower. It was the crisp, sharp silence of total, unconditional victory. The toxic infection had been completely surgically removed from my home. I walked slowly down the hallway and entered the master bedroom. The room was bathed in the warm amber light of the setting sun, casting a peaceful glow over the furniture. I moved toward the solid oak dresser where I had set up a small, dedicated memorial for Evelyn. A polished, silver-framed photograph of her rested next to a flickering white candle. In the picture, she was smiling that brilliant, knowing smile of hers. It was taken on our 30th wedding anniversary. She looked so incredibly vibrant, with her dark skin glowing and her sharp, intelligent eyes staring right through the camera lens. I stood before her portrait and felt the immense, crushing weight of the past month finally lift entirely from my broad shoulders. The heavy burden of grief and bitter betrayal dissolved, leaving behind a fierce, enduring pride. I reached into the inner pocket of my bespoke charcoal suit and pulled out the heavy brass key, the key to safety deposit box 402, the ultimate weapon she had forged with her dying breaths to protect the empire we built together. I held the cold metal in my calloused palm, running my thumb over the engraved numbers. Evelyn, you were the smartest woman I ever knew. I said, my voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. You saw the wolves circling the perimeter while I was still trying to pretend they were just stray dogs. You knew our son was terribly weak. You knew he would willingly trade his own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that was built on stolen timber and lies. But you did not just leave me a simple warning. You handed me the exact tactical blueprint to burn their entire fraudulent kingdom straight to the ground. I carefully placed the brass key on the polished wood of the dresser, resting it gently right at the base of her silver picture frame. It belonged to her. It was the physical manifestation of her brilliant, unyielding legacy. I looked into the eyes of the woman I had loved for 4 decades and gave her a slow, deeply respectful nod. "The debts are fully paid, Evie," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion but completely devoid of any sorrow. "The predators are locked in federal cages, and the foundation of this house is perfectly secure. Mission accomplished." I stood there for a long moment, sharing the quiet victory with the only person who truly understood exactly what it took to build this life from the dirt up. The battle for my own home was over, but my broader war was just beginning. I had seen firsthand exactly how easily a lifetime of hard, honest work could be snatched away by greedy relatives hiding behind fake smiles and forged legal documents. If I had not possessed Evelyn's hidden offshore capital and Richard Gallagher's ruthless legal expertise, I would be sitting in a damp basement right now, waiting to be hauled off to a corrupt psychiatric facility. I knew there were thousands of other older folks out there who did not have the vast resources to fight back. They were being manipulated, coerced, and robbed blind by the very people they raised and trusted. I was not going to sit idly by and let that happen to anyone else. I had already authorized Gallagher to establish a massive philanthropic legal trust, using a significant portion of my recovered assets. We were officially launching the Evelyn Reed Foundation for Elder Financial Defense. I was hiring a full team of aggressive civil litigators, forensic accountants, and private investigators dedicated entirely to dismantling predatory family members and corrupt wealth managers. We were going to offer absolutely free pro bono legal warfare to senior citizens facing financial abuse and forced fraudulent conservatorships. William Kensington and his treacherous daughter were just the first rats I had trapped. There was an entire dark industry of well-dressed thieves preying on the elderly, and I was going to use my newly consolidated wealth to hunt them down one by one. I was turning my survival into a heavily funded, devastating weapon for justice. I walked out of the bedroom and headed toward the custom mahogany wet bar situated in the corner of my spacious living room. I reached for a heavy crystal tumbler and grabbed my most expensive bottle of aged Kentucky bourbon. The liquid amber caught the fading evening light as I poured a generous measure into the glass. I did not add any ice. I did not add any water. I wanted to taste the pure, unfiltered burn. I picked up the heavy glass and walked over to my favorite leather armchair, positioning myself perfectly to look out over my sprawling, manicured property. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, feeling the rich, fiery warmth spread through my chest. I thought about DeAndre wandering the brutal streets of Atlanta without a single dime to his name, stripped of his corporate titles and his luxury cars. I thought about Courtney and William Kensington sitting in sterile federal holding cells, trading their tailored designer suits for scratchy orange jumpsuits, facing decades behind bars. They had vastly underestimated the old black heavy machinery operator. They thought my 69 years meant I was close to the sad end of my road. They thought my age made me an easy target, a fading relic ready to be quietly discarded into the dustbin of history. They were completely, entirely wrong. I leaned back into the thick premium leather of my chair, taking another slow, satisfying sip of the bourbon. My life was not ending. It was undergoing a massive, brutal, and highly successful renovation. I was a 69-year-old man sitting on an absolute mountain of wealth, armed with lethal legal power and totally unbound by the toxic obligations of a treacherous family. I was stepping into a brand new era of absolute freedom, unyielding authority, and zero compromises. I raised my glass to the empty room, toasting the silent house and the brilliant, victorious future ahead. My name is Alfonso Reed, and I am just getting started. If there is one absolute truth I took away from this entire ordeal, it is that real power never has to shout. The Kensingtons spent their entire lives hiding behind loud designer labels and arrogant threats, trying to project an illusion of invincibility. But true strength is built in the quiet, grueling hours when nobody is watching. It is forged in the calluses on your hands and the silent calculations you make while your enemies are busy celebrating their premature victories. Never let anyone make you feel small just because your roots are planted in the dirt. That very dirt is what gives you the solid foundation to weather any storm and eventually bury those who try to destroy you. If you found value in my story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to remember their own undeniable strength.